Somewhere beneath a sky that no longer exists, a city was burning with light. Not the desperate light of fire or war, not yet, but the soft, accumulated glow of 1,000 lamps set into windows and colonnades, reflecting off the dark harbour water, illuminating the faces of merchants and philosophers and sailors who had come from every edge of the known world to stand in the same narrow streets. This was Alexandria, and somewhere within it, in a palace that pressed its foundations against the sea itself, lived a woman that the most powerful empire on earth could not quite bring itself to ignore. Rome feared her. That by itself is worth sitting with for a moment. Rome, which had swallowed kingdoms whole, which had marched through deserts and forests and crossed rivers no army was supposed to cross, found in this one queen something that unsettled it, and not only her armies, not only her treasury, something else, something harder to name. The writers who came after her worked carefully to bury it beneath descriptions of seduction and enchantment, as though a woman capable of threatening the Roman world could only have done so through some kind of magic. But if you slow down, if you sit quietly with the actual record of her life, the fragments that survived, the documents, the coins, the letters, a different figure begins to emerge from the shadows. More complicated, more deliberate, more interesting. That is why we are here tonight. Take a slow breath if you like. Let your body settle. Whatever room you're lying in, whatever city, whatever hour, you are welcome here. This is a long and unhurried journey, and there is nowhere you need to be before morning. If you feel like it, leave a quiet comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. It is a small thing, but there is something lovely about knowing that someone in Edinburgh and someone in Manila and someone in a quiet house in rural Ohio are all here together in the dark, listening to the same story. A story that is more than 2,000 years old, and still, somehow, unfinished. We begin in Alexandria. To understand Cleopatra, you must first try to understand her city. Alexandria in the 1st century before the Common Era was not simply a place. It was an argument. An ongoing, improbable, magnificent argument about what civilization could look like when you refused to choose only one tradition. The city had been founded by Alexander of Macedon, the conqueror whose ambitions had briefly stitched together a world stretching from Greece to the borders of India. And after his death it had passed into the hands of his general Ptolemy, who made it the capital of his new Egyptian kingdom and filled it, deliberately and ambitiously, with everything the ancient world had to offer. The library was here, the Mausion, the ancient institution of learning from which we eventually inherited the word museum, was here. Astronomers calculated the circumference of the Earth in this city. Physicians dissected the human body and wrote down what they found. Poets translated ancient texts and created new ones. The harbour held a lighthouse so large and so luminous that sailors navigating from the open Mediterranean could see it from 40 miles away. A beacon not only of light, but of intention. Here, it seemed to say, is a place worth finding. And into this world, 3 streams of culture ran together and tangled and sometimes merged. There was the Greek intellectual tradition that the Ptolemies had imported and cultivated with care. There was the ancient Egyptian religious world, with its gods and its rituals and its cosmologies that had been accumulating for 3,000 years before Alexander ever arrived. And pressing in from the west, growing louder with every passing decade, was Rome. Practical, ambitious, deeply uncomfortable with anyone who seemed to be its equal. Cleopatra was born into the middle of all 3. She was Ptolemaic royalty, which meant she was Macedonian Greek by descent. The family had ruled Egypt for more than 2 centuries by the time she arrived, though most of her predecessors had never bothered to learn the language of the country they governed. She was also, in a way that mattered to her and to her subjects, deeply Egyptian. She would become the first of her dynasty to speak Egyptian fluently. She would present herself in temples carved in the old style, dressed in the robes of Isis, performing the rituals of a civilization that had endured longer than most of history. And she understood Rome, its hunger, its politics, its vanities, well enough to move within it as something close to an equal, which may have been the thing Rome found most difficult to forgive. Her life would become a crossing point. She ruled during the decades when the Roman Republic was tearing itself apart from the inside, when the old system of shared power was straining under the ambitions of men who wanted something the Republic was not designed to give them. Caesar, Pompey, Antony, Octavian. Each of them passed through her world, and she through theirs. And Egypt, ancient, wealthy, complex Egypt, was both the prize they circled and the witness to everything that was changing. This is the arc we will follow tonight, slowly, without rushing. A girl born into a dynasty already under pressure, an education that made her formidable, a throne won and lost and won again, a series of alliances made not in weakness but in calculation. And then, at the far end of the story, when the world had shifted in ways no one had quite predicted, a kingdom facing its last quiet dawn. She has been called a seductress, a sorceress, a fool, a saint. She has been painted by Renaissance masters and played by Hollywood stars. She has been reduced and exaggerated and borrowed for purposes that had very little to do with who she actually was. But tonight, we set all of that aside. Tonight, we go back to the harbour lights, back to the city where the lighthouse burned, back to the beginning of a life that would change the world, and that the world would spend the next 2 millennia trying, with uneven success, to understand. If you close your eyes and try to place yourself there, really there, on the streets of Alexandria sometime in the 1st century before the Common Era, what you would notice first is probably not what you expect. Not grandeur exactly, not overwhelming spectacle, something quieter. The smell of salt water and cedar oil and something faintly sweet drifting from the market stalls that stayed open long after the sun had gone down. The sound of languages layering over one another, Greek in the colonnades, Aramaic near the eastern harbour, Egyptian in the narrow lanes behind the temple precincts, Latin growing more audible with every passing year, pressing in like the tide, sandals on polished stone, the distant knock of wooden hulls against the dock, and the light. The light in Alexandria at night was unlike anything in the ancient world, and most of the ancient world knew it. The great lighthouse, called the Pharaohs, after the small island where it stood just offshore, was not merely functional, though it was emphatically that. It was one of the tallest structures human hands had ever built, a tower rising perhaps 130 metres above the harbour entrance, with a fire burning at its peak that could be seen, in favourable conditions, from the open sea at distances that still seem improbable. Sailors navigating the featureless dark of the Mediterranean would watch for it, the way travellers in a strange city watch for a familiar landmark, a point of orientation, something that said, "You are not lost." Below it, Alexandria spread itself along a narrow strip of coast between the sea and a long inland lake, its streets laid out in a grid of unusual order, its principal avenues wide enough for several carts abreast. The royal quarter pressed close to the eastern harbour, a complex of palaces and gardens and small temples and administrative buildings that together occupied, by some estimates, a quarter of the entire city. It was an almost excessive concentration of beauty and purpose in one corner of one city on the edge of one continent, and it was there that the Ptolemaic Dynasty had chosen to place everything it valued most. The library was part of this world. We sometimes imagine ancient libraries as hushed rooms of scrolls and silence, and in one sense that is accurate. But the Great Library of Alexandria was not merely a collection, it was an argument about power, a declaration that the rulers of Egypt intended to possess not just territory and treasure, but knowledge itself. The Ptolemies had built it with ambition so large it was almost difficult to hold in one thought. By some accounts, they sent agents to the harbours to search the ships coming in from every port in the Mediterranean, asking for any scrolls on board to be copied before their owners could reclaim them. The originals, in some versions of the story, stayed in Alexandria. The copies went home. Whether or not every such story is literally true, the scale it suggests is real enough. At its height, the library may have held hundreds of thousands of papyrus rolls, works of philosophy, medicine, astronomy, drama, poetry, mathematics, history, gathered from Greece and Persia and India and Egypt itself. The Mausion, which stood nearby, was something like a research institution, a place where scholars were housed and fed by the royal court in exchange for their work, their ideas, their presence in what the Ptolemies clearly intended to be the intellectual centre of the world. This was not charity, it was strategy. A ruler who controlled the scrolls controlled something invisible and therefore powerful, the record of how things had been, the frameworks through which people understood their world. The library was a form of governance as much as a form of scholarship, and the Ptolemies understood this in a way that gives you a slightly different picture of the civilization that produced Cleopatra. She was not born into a dynasty of dreamers. She was born into a dynasty of collectors, of land, of loyalty, of knowledge, of legitimacy. And Alexandria itself embodied this collecting impulse. The city was, in a sense, an experiment in what happened when you refused to separate the traditions you had inherited. Greek was the language of administration, of philosophy, of the court and the law. But Egypt was not simply a backdrop. The temples along the Nile, some of them older than Greek civilization itself, were still active, still powerful, still visited by enormous numbers of people, for whom Isis and Osiris and Amun and Horus were not mythology, but living fact. The Ptolemies had learned, or at least partially learned, that you could not govern Egypt by ignoring Egypt, and so many of them had presented themselves in the old style, carved onto temple walls in Egyptian costume, performing Egyptian rites, accepting the ancient titles that the priest conferred. The result was a city of layered identities. Walk from one neighbourhood to the next, and the character of the streets shifted. The smell of incense changed, the carvings on the doorposts changed, the gods watching from the corners changed. And through all of it moved the traders and the scholars and the priests and the bureaucrats of a place that belonged, simultaneously, to several civilizations at once. This made Alexandria wealthy in ways that were difficult to calculate. Trade routes passed through it almost inevitably. Grain from the Egyptian interior, luxury goods from the east, papyrus and linen and glass, the animals and spices and dyes that the Mediterranean world depended on. The harbour was almost never quiet. Ships arrived and departed and arrived again, and the taxes and levies that the Ptolemaic administration collected on all of it accumulated into a treasury that was, for most of the dynasty's history, staggeringly large. Rome had noticed. Rome had been noticing for a long time. There was something about Egypt, its age, its wealth, its density of meaning, that made Rome both covetous and uneasy. The Roman writers who described Alexandria often reached, without quite meaning to, for language that suggested they found it slightly too much. Too large, too old, too full of itself, too comfortable with its own significance. And the wealth, of course, always the wealth. Egypt could feed enormous populations. Egypt's treasury could fund enormous armies. Egypt, in the hands of someone willing to use it deliberately, was not simply a kingdom. It was a set of possibilities. And on a night you can almost feel now, if you sit still enough, a night of harbour sounds and lamplight and the distant cry of a bird above the pharaohs. A girl was growing up in that palace by the eastern sea, surrounded by all of it. The scrolls and the sacred landscapes and the foreign merchants and the Roman envoys and the smell of the sea salt that came in through every window. Learning what it all meant, deciding piece by piece what to do with it. The city was her first education, and it taught her everything. The dynasty she was born into did not begin in Egypt. It began in grief, when Alexander of Macedon died in Babylon in the summer of 323 before the Common Era. Young, without a clear heir, having conquered more of the known world than any single person before him, what he left behind was not an empire so much as an argument. His generals, the men who had ridden with him across Persia and into the edges of India, looked at the territories they had helped him take, and began, almost immediately, to divide. They were called the Diadochi, the successors, and the world they built from Alexander's wreckage was one of competing kingdoms, each one insisting, with varying degrees of conviction, that it carried the true flame of what Alexander had been. One of those generals was named Ptolemy. He was shrewd in a particular way, not always the boldest in battle, but extraordinarily clear-eyed about what actually lasted. He took Egypt, and in taking Egypt, he took something that none of the other successors quite had. A civilization already ancient beyond reckoning, a land defined by its own logic and its own deep memory, a population accustomed to being administered, but not accustomed to being erased. Ptolemy understood this, or came to understand it. He did not try to turn Egypt into Macedonia. He took the title Pharaoh, he accepted the ceremonies, he allowed the temples their authority, and he moved the capital to Alexandria, which Alexander himself had founded on the northwestern coast, a city positioned outward toward the Mediterranean world, while still being rooted in Egyptian soil. What he founded would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. 3 centuries is a long time for any dynasty, long enough to accumulate traditions and contradictions both, The Ptolemies became, across those generations, something genuinely difficult to categorize. A Greek-speaking royal house that governed an Egyptian kingdom, that built temples to Egyptian gods while writing philosophy in Greek, that wore the double crown of the pharaohs in public while hosting symposia in the Macedonian fashion in private. They were a dynasty of layered performances, and like all performances, the question of where the performance ended and the truth began was one that even they may not always have been able to answer. The court culture they built was elaborate to a degree that would be difficult to overstate. Ceremony had weight, image had consequence. Every element of how the ruler appeared and the titles used, the robes worn, the gods invoked, the coins struck, communicated something specific to specific audiences. The same king might present himself to the Egyptian priesthood as the living Horus, and to the Greek-speaking administrators as a philosopher king in the tradition of the Hellenistic world. And neither presentation was exactly false. Both were true and calculated simultaneously, and the skill of holding them together without visible seam was itself a form of governance. This placed enormous pressure on legitimacy. Who you were, or rather, who you could convincingly claim to be, mattered as urgently as anything you actually did. And because the court was a world of rivals as much as it was a world of allies, legitimacy was always slightly precarious. Brothers watched brothers, sisters watched sisters. Advisors who attached themselves to one royal child watched very carefully what the other children were doing. The palace in Alexandria was beautiful, and it was also a place where proximity to power meant exposure to everything that people with power were willing to do to keep it. Among the most distinctive, and to later eyes most striking, practices of the Ptolemaic Dynasty was the habit of marriage within the family itself. Brothers married sisters, uncles sometimes married nieces. The pattern, seen from the outside, can seem simply bizarre, but it had a logic that was in its own way coldly practical. Egypt had been governed for thousands of years before the Ptolemies arrived, by a royal tradition in which the divine nature of kingship was understood to run in the blood. To marry outside the line was to introduce a dilution, a claim from the spouse's family on the children and therefore on the throne. To marry within it was to concentrate authority, to keep the bloodline sealed, to ensure that when the next generation inherited, no foreign house could point to a grandmother or a grandfather and say, "This ruler is partly ours." There was also, quietly, the example of the gods themselves. Isis and Osiris were siblings. The divine precedent existed, and the Ptolemies did not hesitate to inhabit it. The results of all this were complicated and often violent. Dynasties that marry inward do not thereby escape rivalry. They simply ensure that when rivalry surfaces, it surfaces between people who are very close. The history of the Ptolemies is full of siblings who began as co-rulers and ended as enemies, of brothers who had sisters exiled or executed, of mothers who governed as regents and found their own sons working against them before the sons were fully grown. The palace was a place of dense affection and equally dense suspicion, and the two feelings were often directed at the same people. Beneath all of this, Egypt itself continued. The country the Ptolemies governed was not simply a backdrop to their dramas. It was one of the most complex administrative entities in the ancient world. A long, narrow corridor of fertility running south from the delta into territories that shaded gradually into desert, and then into regions that were something else entirely. Managing it required an infrastructure of officials and tax collectors, and grain administrators and canal overseers that extended into every nome, every village, every field. The Ptolemies had inherited this infrastructure from the pharaohs who came before them and had, to their credit, largely maintained it. The bureaucracy of Egypt was ancient and efficient and, when it functioned, capable of generating wealth on a scale that still impresses. But maintaining control over a land that diverse, Greek settlers in the cities, Egyptian farmers in the countryside, Jewish communities in Alexandria and elsewhere, Nubian populations to the south, merchant communities from across the eastern Mediterranean, required constant negotiation. The Ptolemies needed the priesthoods, who controlled the religious life of enormous portions of the population, and whose authority in the countryside was, in practical terms, nearly as powerful as the crown's own. They needed the Greek-speaking administrative class, they needed the traders, and they needed all of these groups to believe that the arrangement was stable, that the dynasty at the centre of it was legitimate and enduring, and not in the process of quietly falling apart. That last belief became harder and harder to sustain as the generations passed. By the time we arrive at the century into which Cleopatra would be born, the Ptolemaic Dynasty had been weakening for a long time in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. The later Ptolemies were, with some exceptions, less capable than their predecessors, less administratively focused, more susceptible to the influence of courtiers and favourites, more prone to the internal fractures that the dynasty's own marriage practices kept generating. Succession disputes had become almost routine. On more than one occasion, different members of the royal family had held different parts of Egypt simultaneously, each claiming to be the rightful ruler, each looking for allies to tip the balance. And there was one place that everyone in the Ptolemaic court was looking toward with increasing anxiety, whether they admitted it or not. Rome had been growing for a long time. It had absorbed the western Mediterranean, then the eastern. Its legions had moved through territories that had seemed, not so long before, permanent and independent, and Rome had a particular habit of waiting, of watching kingdoms weaken from within, watching the factions within those kingdoms appeal to Rome for support, and then arriving, at the right moment, as something between an arbiter and a new landlord. Egypt had not yet been absorbed, but Egypt had been noticed, and the men who would eventually press their claims in Alexandria were already watching from the west, measuring the distance, reading the reports. The dynasty that Cleopatra inherited was magnificent and it was fragile, and those two qualities were not unrelated. The grandeur was real. The library was real. The ceremonies and the title and the accumulated weight of 3 centuries were real. But somewhere inside all of it, a slow pressure had been building. The pressure that comes when a great thing has been in the process of ending for longer than anyone wants to acknowledge. She would be born into the inheritance of all of it, the beauty and the fractures both. Egypt, in this period, was more than a kingdom. It was a hinge. To the north lay the Mediterranean, a sea that had become, by Cleopatra's time, something like a single, restless highway of trade, war, and ideas. To the south, the Nile climbed into regions that connected through caravans and river routes to the interior of Africa and the Red Sea. To the east lay the Levant, and beyond it, the great land routes that led toward Mesopotamia and further still. Egypt sat at the meeting point of these worlds, and that position carried with it a very specific kind of power. Some of that power was simple and physical. The Nile's annual flood, regular if not perfectly predictable, turned long strips of land on either side of the river into some of the most reliably fertile soil in the ancient world. Grain was Egypt's great export, its quiet weapon and its most valuable promise. In years when other regions suffered poor harvests, Egypt could, if its own flood had been generous and its administration competent, feed entire populations beyond its borders. By the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, this meant that Egypt could feed Rome. The city on the Tiber had become vast and its appetite had grown as its territories spread. Armies needed grain. Urban populations needed grain. Grain could be used as payment, as subsidy, as a tool of politics. A ruler who controlled a great surplus of it possessed a kind of leverage that did not need to shout. Egypt was that ruler's dream. Fields that, when properly taxed and transported, filled warehouses and ship holds with a pale, measurable form of influence. Alongside the grain came money. The Ptolemies minted their own coinage, controlled customs duties, and profited from trade streaming in and out of Alexandria's harbours. Merchants brought goods from as far as India along Red Sea routes and overland trails. Others came from Greece, Asia Minor and beyond. Alexandria sat, glittering and busy, at a crossroads that made it not only a centre of learning, but a centre of finance. For a long time, this combination of grain and money allowed the Ptolemies to act like sponsors in their own right, funding temples, paying soldiers, hiring mercenaries when necessary, and occasionally inserting themselves into the affairs of neighbouring kingdoms. But by the time Cleopatra was born, that balance had shifted. The weight of Rome had entered the equation. Rome did not conquer Egypt by storming it outright, not at first. Rome had other methods, slower and in some ways more insidious. It lent money. It made and unmade kings in other Hellenistic courts. It cultivated factions. Senators and generals developed personal relationships with foreign rulers, and those relationships became channels through which influence could flow. We can see traces of this process in the record. Some Ptolemaic rulers, facing internal disputes, looked to Rome as an arbiter. Embassies travelled back and forth. When there were succession crises or revolts, it became almost instinctive for some Egyptian factions to send representatives westward, asking the Senate for recognition, for support, for guarantees. Each request granted came with invisible strings attached. Each favour done set a precedent. There were loans too. By the mid-1st century before the Common Era, Egypt seems to have been in significant debt to influential Romans. The details are not always clear, but we hear of enormous sums extended by Roman financiers and political figures, and of Ptolemaic rulers whose continued security on the throne depended on these arrangements remaining intact. Money flowed out of Egypt as tribute and as repayment, even as grain flowed out as supply. The kingdom that had once been a patron in its own right was slowly being repositioned as a client. Such dependence had internal consequences. To service foreign debts, taxes could be raised more aggressively. The pressure of extraction on farmers, on artisans, on the temple estates intensified. In a system already intricate and often rigid, this additional strain could turn discontent into open unrest. We begin to see, in the surviving papyri and historical accounts, hints of this tension. There were riots in Alexandria, disputes between different ethnic communities, outbreaks of violence that had to be suppressed by royal troops. In the countryside, there were episodes of resistance to officials, and periods in which banditry blurred into something closer to organised rebellion. The priesthoods, whose cooperation was essential, could become sullen or defiant if they felt that their privileges were being eroded, or that the king was no longer honouring traditional obligations. At court, the atmosphere grew more volatile. A dynasty that was already inclined toward internal rivalry now found that external powers were watching, and sometimes quietly encouraging those rivalries. A prince or princess who feared being sidelined might think, not only of the factions within the palace, but of which Roman could be persuaded to champion their cause. To Roman eyes, each claimant was another possible door into Egypt. What this produced from the outside was a picture of instability. Rulers deposed and restored, coups attempted, alliances reforming with dizzying speed. From the inside, it must have felt like living on a fault line. The ceremonial life of the court continued. Festivals, processions, dedications to the gods. But beneath the bright surfaces, there was a sense that fortune could tilt suddenly. Power remained magnificent, but it no longer felt entirely secure. Cleopatra was born into this world of exposed edges. We cannot reconstruct the details of her earliest years with certainty. The sources are thin and often written long after the fact, shaped by Roman politics and by the desire to read her life backward from its dramatic end. But we can infer some of the conditions that surrounded her childhood. She would have grown up in a palace where the names of powerful Romans were already familiar, men whose decisions in the Senate or on distant battlefields could alter the fate of her family. She would have heard, directly or indirectly, of embassies sent to plead cases in Rome, of debts discussed in private chambers, of governors and generals whose approval or disapproval mattered in ways that would have been unthinkable to the first Ptolemies. She would also have been aware, even as a child, of the tension in Alexandria itself, a city that could, without much warning, erupt. The same dense urban life that made it so intellectually alive also meant that anger could gather quickly in the streets and squares. Rumours travelled fast, of new taxes, of grain shortages, of decisions made by the king or his advisors that some group or another found intolerable. Inside the palace, she would have watched how adults behaved when they were uncertain, who lowered their voice when a particular name was mentioned, who chose their words carefully when discussing Rome or rivals within the family, who seemed buoyant when news arrived from abroad, and who suddenly disappeared from view when the political tide turned. Children in such environments learn early that tone and timing are a language of their own. What we can say, with some confidence, is that Cleopatra's world taught her the importance of reading power, accurately, patiently, and without illusion. Legitimacy, she would have seen, was no longer a simple matter of wearing the right crowns and performing the right rituals. It had become a negotiation between multiple audiences: the Egyptian populace, the Greek-speaking elites, the priesthoods, the army, and increasingly Rome itself. Alongside the calculations and the debts, there were omens. Ancient Egyptians, and the Ptolemaic court with them, inhabited a universe in which political events and cosmic signs were not neatly separated. Unusual floods, eclipses, strange patterns in the stars, the birth of animals with unexpected markings. These could all be interpreted as messages about the favour or displeasure of the gods. In times of stress, such interpretations multiplied. We do not have a complete list of the signs that may have been observed in Cleopatra's childhood, but later writers hint at a period heavy with portents. Prodigies reported in Rome, alignments of planets, comets seen as warnings. In Egypt, where the stars and the flooding river were long regarded as texts to be read, such phenomena would have resonated. Priests performed rituals to secure divine support. Kings commissioned inscriptions stressing their piety and their unique relationship to the gods, as if to steady the narrative against the visible fragility of their rule. In this atmosphere, a royal child like Cleopatra was not simply a person, but a symbol. Her birth could be framed as a sign of renewal, her name invoked in dedications and prayers. She grew up as part of a story that others were constantly telling about Egypt's future, a story in which the kingdom's survival was uncertain, but in which hope still gathered around figures who seemed capable, in some imagined way, of turning the tide. If the Ptolemaic house felt itself surrounded by omens, it was because so much in their world seemed poised between continuance and collapse. Debt and diplomacy tied them to Rome. Faction and unrest pulled at them from within. Above all of it, priests watched the heavens and the river, seeking patterns that might offer reassurance. Into this landscape of grain ships and anxious embassies, portents and palace whispers, Cleopatra grew, absorbing, perhaps unconsciously at first, the lesson that would shape her adult life. That to survive in such a world, one had to listen carefully, weigh every signal and move when the moment came with precision. In such a world, knowledge was not a luxury, it was a kind of armour. For a princess of the Ptolemaic house, education began early and reached far. The dynasty that ruled from Alexandria was Macedonian Greek in origin, steeped in the traditions of Hellenistic courts, where philosophers, rhetoricians, mathematicians and poets moved in and out of royal circles. The palace was not only a residence, but a passageway into the great intellectual machinery of the city. We cannot follow Cleopatra from tutor to tutor, lesson to lesson. The details have not survived, but the shape of her education emerges from what we know of her world and from how she later behaved when the stakes were highest. She would have grown up hearing Greek spoken in many registers, the formal, carefully measured language of decrees and philosophy, and the quick conversational tones of courtiers, merchants and scholars. Around her, in the streets of Alexandria and the halls of the palace, were other tongues as well. Egyptian in its late forms, Aramaic, Latin, perhaps snatches of Hebrew and other languages of the Eastern Mediterranean. The city was a tide pool of voices, constantly replenished by new arrivals. Most Ptolemaic rulers had been content to remain, linguistically, at a distance from much of their population. They spoke Greek, governed through Greek, issued their commands and proclamations through intermediaries who translated and adapted them. Cleopatra, by contrast, would later be remembered, even by hostile Roman writers, as speaking many languages herself, without interpreters. The exact number has been exaggerated and stylized, as numbers often are in ancient accounts. But the core impression is consistent. She listened in many idioms and replied in kind. If we imagine her education, we must imagine language as its foundation. Greek literature would have been central, Homeric epics, tragic poetry, philosophical dialogues. Rhetoric, the art of persuasion, was a staple of elite schooling in the Hellenistic world. Princes and princesses learned not just to speak, but to speak in ways that could move assemblies, charm small groups, or advise in private councils. Voice was a tool of power, and the training of that voice, its cadence, its arguments, its timing, was a serious discipline. Cleopatra's later conversations with Roman generals and senators suggest that she absorbed this discipline with unusual care. Those who wrote about her in Latin described her speech as compelling, even when they wished to cast her in a negative light. They spoke of an eloquence that made ideas feel vivid, that gave her presence beyond her physical size or mere title. In the cautious language of political enemies, this is as close as we come to an acknowledgement of mastery. Yet her education did not unfold in a purely Greek world. Outside the palace walls, the ancient traditions of Egypt continued, adapted but not erased by centuries of foreign rule. The priests of the great temples in places like Philae, Dendera and Memphis kept their own schools of learning. Hieroglyphic and demotic scripts, ritual texts, astronomical observations, complex calendars, and the long, intricate mythology that linked each ritual act to the cycles of the cosmos. The Ptolemies could not rule Egypt without these priesthoods. Their legitimacy in the countryside and in the deep symbolic life of the kingdom depended on being recognised as proper pharaohs, protectors of Maat, the cosmic order, chosen of gods whose names were older than the Greek language itself. This meant endowments for temples, tax privileges for sacred estates, and careful attention to how each king and queen was represented in inscriptions and reliefs. There is good reason to think that Cleopatra, more than many of her predecessors, entered into this world not just as sponsor but as student. Later Egyptian temple inscriptions show her in the full array of pharaonic imagery, offering to the gods, crowned and named in hieroglyphs according to traditions that reached back to earlier dynasties. To appear in this way convincingly, she had to understand, at least in outline, the theology and politics beneath the stone. Her tutors, then, were likely not only Greek philosophers and rhetoricians, but Egyptian priests who could explain the cycles of festivals, the meanings of sacred animals, the expectations placed upon a ruler who called herself daughter of Ra, or beloved of Isis. Through them she would have encountered a different way of thinking about time and authority, one in which the king or queen was a necessary hinge between human and divine realms. This dual formation, Hellenistic and Egyptian, shaped the particular kind of intelligence Cleopatra brought to rule. In the libraries and scholarly circles of Alexandria, where texts from across the known world were collected, catalogued and debated, she would have encountered philosophical discussions about ethics, governance and the nature of the cosmos. Stoic, Peripatetic and other schools were present in the city. Their ideas seeped into court culture. Questions about the best way to govern, about justice and necessity, were not abstract for someone in her position. They were preparation. At the same time, the Egyptian religious framework placed emphasis on maintaining balance between flood and drought, order and chaos, prosperity and neglect. Rulers who failed in this could be framed as having lost divine favour. Priests were adept at reading political choices as spiritual ones and spiritual acts as political signals. Cleopatra's exposure to this system would have taught her that every public gesture carried multiple meanings, that decrees and donations would be weighed not just by accountants but by theologians. When she later issued proclamations in different languages or appeared differently robed before different audiences, this was not mere showmanship. It was a fluent use of multiple traditions learned over years. To Greek-speaking elites, she could be a cultivated Hellenistic monarch, conversant in philosophy, quoting poets, engaging in the measured exchanges of the symposium and the council chamber. To Egyptian subjects and priesthoods, she could present herself as a pious pharaoh, renewing temple privileges, performing or at least sponsoring the rituals that bound gods and land together. In a world increasingly entangled with Rome, this ability to shift register was crucial. Roman envoys, accustomed to dealing with kings who needed them, encountered instead a queen who could speak their language, understand their political vocabulary, and frame her own interests in terms that resonated with theirs. The same training that taught her the subtleties of Greek argument and Egyptian theology would have allowed her to read Roman ambition with clarity, to sense when flattery might be useful, when firmness was required, and when delay might serve as its own kind of answer. It is tempting, when thinking of royal education, to picture it as ornament, poetry recited in candlelit rooms, philosophy as a kind of refined leisure. In Cleopatra's case, the line between study and survival was thin. Each discipline she absorbed was, in some way, preparation for the negotiations and crises that awaited her. Mathematics and accounts mattered when balancing temple endowments against royal debts. Geography mattered when deciding where to send grain and how to speak of it to allies or rivals. Even the study of omens and rituals had a political dimension, teaching her how others would interpret earthquakes, unusual floods, or the appearance of a comet. Over time, all of this knowledge fused into something less easily categorized, a sense of how to inhabit different roles without losing the thread of her own purpose. Child of a Macedonian dynasty, pharaoh in the eyes of Egyptian priests, ally, sometimes supplicant, sometimes near equal in the eyes of Romans. To move among these identities required more than charm. It required an education that treated words as instruments, ceremonies as negotiations, and culture itself as a field of strategy. When later writers, especially Roman ones, tried to explain her influence, they reached for the language they understood. Allure, fascination, enchantment. But beneath those metaphors lay something simpler, and in some ways, more formidable. Cleopatra had been trained, from youth, to listen more than once to every message, to hear not just the spoken sentence but the tradition behind it, and she had learned to answer from precisely the place that would matter most to whoever was listening. Her voice, in this sense, was an extension of her education. Not only the sound of it, which contemporaries described as captivating, but its content and calibration. Whether she was addressing Alexandrian crowds, rural temple communities, Greek advisors, or Roman power brokers, she could shape her words so that each audience heard in them a reflection of its own history and hopes. This was the education that awaited her when her childhood gave way to public life. Not a gentle entrance into a stable order, but a step forward into a contested space where every phrase, every ritual, every promise could tip alliances. And it was with this carefully forged voice that she would soon have to confront the more intimate dangers of her own family. Family, for a Ptolemaic ruler, was never only a private matter. It was the framework through which power moved, the set of names to which armies and treasuries and priesthoods were legally attached. Brothers were not simply brothers, sisters not simply sisters. They were potential co-rulers, rivals, consorts, or convenient ghosts, disappeared when they no longer fit the pattern others wished to weave. Cleopatra's step into that dangerous pattern began with a death. Her father, Ptolemy XII, the king who had fled his own capital and bought back his throne with Roman gold, did not leave behind a secure inheritance. His reign had been marked by chronic debt, unpopular taxes, and the visible humiliation of relying on distant senators for the restoration of his crown. When he died, probably in 51 BCE, the kingdom passed in theory to a carefully arranged pair, his eldest surviving daughter, Cleopatra, and a younger son, Ptolemy XIII. The arrangement was set down in the king's will, and was likely reinforced by those Romans who stood to benefit from a compliant Egypt. The siblings were to rule together, united not only by blood but, according to dynastic custom, by marriage. She was around 18. He was several years younger, still not fully out of childhood. On papyrus, it might have looked like continuity. In the echoing corridors of the palace, it felt more like an opening. A young queen, recently emerged from tutors' rooms into councils and ceremonies, came suddenly to share a throne with a boy who could not yet speak for himself in matters of state. Around and behind them moved older men whose names are only partially preserved by the sources: guardians, advisors, eunuchs, generals, those who'd survived the previous reigns and learned how to pull the quieter strings. The machinery of regency, once set in motion, has a momentum of its own. When a monarch is too young to rule alone, someone must sign documents, oversee taxation, negotiate with foreign envoys, signal favour or disapproval to the priesthoods. In Egypt, as elsewhere, this meant that a network of officials positioned themselves as protectors of the young king, interpreters of his will, filters between the royal family and the palace gates. Cleopatra stepped into this network not as a passive figurehead, but as someone already trained to hear the unspoken meanings behind each proposal. The records that survive from these early years of co-rule are fragmentary, yet her outline appears in them with a certain clarity. Decrees were issued in her name first, before that of Ptolemy XIII. Coins bore her image, sometimes alone. In some documents she appears without her brother at all, as if she were testing the reach of her singular authority. This was not an abstract experiment. Behind the inscriptions lay daily negotiations, with city magistrates over civic privileges, with temple estates over taxes, with Roman financiers over the schedule of debt payments. Each decision touched some powerful group, pleased one circle while troubling another. A queen who refused to be merely the older guardian of a minor king would quickly be felt as a disturbance by those who had expected to rule from the shadows. Opposition gathered, as it often does, through the language of protection. Certain high officials, most famously the eunuch Pothinus, along with a tutor general named Achilles, appear in later accounts as the architects of a faction around Ptolemy XIII. They could present themselves as the natural guardians of a boy king who, in their telling, was being overshadowed by an overconfident sister. To strengthen their position was, they might argue, to restore balance between the co-rulers, to shield the kingdom from the errors of youth and inexperience. But which youth? Whose inexperience? Those same accounts, mostly Roman and written later, admit indirectly that Cleopatra was the one conducting diplomacy, the one whose name carried immediate recognition with foreign envoys. The conflict, then, was not between age and youth, but between two visions of how Egypt should be steered through its difficult passage, by a queen who intended to rule actively, or by ministers who preferred a malleable king. Slowly the balance shifted. At first, the changes might have been almost imperceptible. A petition redirected from Cleopatra's chamber to the offices of Pothinus, a military appointment granted in the name of the king alone, treasurers instructed to seek double signatures where before one had sufficed. Each small adjustment taken alone could be explained. Taken together, they mark the tightening of a circle. By 49 BCE, the tension ripened into open break. Cleopatra disappears abruptly from certain official documents. Coins cease to show her image. Her name is pushed behind that of her brother, then drops away entirely from some decrees. The palace faction had moved from subtle rebalancing to open displacement. The moment of removal is not described in detail by any ancient writer. There is no preserved scene of accusation in the throne room or nighttime arrest in a lamplit corridor. We only know the outcome. Cleopatra was no longer in Alexandria. Ptolemy XIII and his guardians held the capital. The older sister, the one who had spoken first in decrees, was gone. Exile in this context did not mean a wandering without resources. Cleopatra was still a Ptolemy, still recognized by many as rightful queen. When she retreated eastward, into the rougher borderlands near Syria and the Levant, she did so with attendants, loyalists, and whatever funds she could carry or summon. The frontier was less polished than Alexandria, but it offered something the palace no longer did: space to move. We can imagine the change in soundscape. The layered voices of the Mausion and the court gave way to harsher winds, to caravan bells and soldiers' drills, to the mingled accents of mercenaries from Crete, Asia Minor, and beyond. Out here, away from the marble pavements, the kingdom's edges were guarded by men who sold their swords to those who could pay and persuade. Cleopatra knew how to do both. In these months on the frontier, she appears in our sources as a figure gathering strength rather than lamenting loss. She recruited troops, likely drawing on the same networks of Greek and Eastern mercenaries that had long fed Ptolemaic armies. She must have written letters to cities and local rulers, reminding them of sworn loyalties, of past honours given by her father, of the legal weight of the will that had named her co-ruler. Yet she did not rush blindly back toward the capital at the head of the first contingent she could assemble. To challenge Ptolemy XIII and his regents too soon would risk not just defeat but annihilation, especially with Roman politics in turmoil and Roman legions moving unpredictably across the eastern Mediterranean. Patience now was as important as courage. This was where her education, so attuned to timing, to the reading of tides in men's affairs and in the heavens, became a quiet ally. She waited, listening for a change not only in her own circumstances but in the larger pattern. Far away, that pattern was already shifting. Rome, the great patron and creditor of Egypt, was convulsed by its own civil war. Julius Caesar had crossed a river called the Rubicon and marched on his rival Pompey. Battles were fought on Italian soil, then beyond it, until Pompey, driven from defeat, sailed east in search of refuge. He chose Egypt, where a boy king and his advisors believed they could win Caesar's favour by a single brutal act. Their choice would stain the sands of the Nile and send a new wave of Roman power surging toward Alexandria. On the frontier, Cleopatra would have heard the news in fragments. Rumours of defeat at Pharsalus, of fleets scattered, of Pompey's ships shadowing the eastern coasts. Slowly, the outline of an opportunity emerged. The struggle between herself and her brother's faction was about to be drawn into the gravity of a much greater conflict. The wheel was turning again. This time, when it came to rest on Egypt, it would bring with it the very man whose name had restored her father, the man who now held Rome in his hands. Cleopatra, patient in exile, would be ready to step into that turning and to test whether her carefully forged voice could shape the terms on which Rome entered her world. By the time Julius Caesar's ships edged toward the Egyptian coast, the civil war that had begun on a small Italian river had already drawn half the Mediterranean into its orbit. Years earlier, when Cleopatra's father knelt to Roman power, Rome itself had still been a republic in name and habit, its rivalries loud but contained within senatorial forms. By 48 BCE, those forms were cracking. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon with a single legion and a deliberate violation of custom, refusing to put down his command on schedule, refusing to bow to the authority of men who feared his popularity and his victories. Against him stood Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, once his ally, now the Senate's chosen defender. Armies had marched and countermarched through Italy, then away from it, like great flocks turning in the sky. Their clash at Pharsalus, in northern Greece, left the field thick with the remains of Pompey's hopes. Caesar's forces, outnumbered but better led, broke the opposition line and shattered it. The man who had once cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and routed kings rode from the field not as a victor but as a fugitive, his prestige suddenly a burden he carried from harbour to harbour. He needed a place where his name still meant safety. He chose Egypt. From Pompey's perspective, the choice had a certain logic. Egypt was rich, the grain storehouse that kept Roman markets supplied, the lender who had financed campaigns and bribed assemblies. Egyptian kings, including Cleopatra's father, owed their thrones in part to Roman patrons. Pompey himself had been one of those patrons. Surely he might think the gratitude of the Ptolemaic house would extend at least to harbour an audience, perhaps even to new troops. But the Egypt he approached was not simply a grateful client state waiting to shelter him. It was a court divided, ruled in name by a boy, Ptolemy XIII, whose ministers watched the wider war with careful calculation. News travelled ahead of Pompey, the story of Pharsalus, of routed legions, of senators in flight. By the time his ships appeared off the Egyptian coast, Achillas the general, Pothinus the eunuch regent, and the other power brokers around Ptolemy XIII had already asked themselves a harder question. Which Roman would shape the future now? To them, Pompey was no longer a kingmaker, but a beaten man whose presence might call Caesar's anger down upon any who sheltered him. The logic of gratitude shrivelled beside the logic of survival. They did not ask how best to repay an old ally, but how best to impress a dangerous new victor. Their answer took the form of an invitation and a small boat. Pompey was promised a respectful reception, a meeting with the king's ministers on Egyptian soil. He stepped into a skiff with a handful of attendants, his wife and son watching anxiously from the deck of their ship. The shoreline came closer. Sand, low waves, a few mounted officers in royal livery. Somewhere inland, the palaces of Alexandria shimmered in the heat. Before he could reach them, the men in the boat turned on him. Roman sources, even those hostile to Pompey, pause here. The killing of a man who had once commanded Rome's greatest armies was not accomplished with ceremony. It was sudden, clumsy, ugly. Steel in flesh, shouts, the unsteady roll of the small craft. His head was cut off as proof. His body, they say, was left in the surf. On the shore, Egyptian officials believed they had committed an act of clever alignment. They would present Caesar not with a dilemma, but with a gift, the head of his rival, already removed, the threat already neutralized. Egypt would signal that it had chosen the winning side. Far away, still at sea, Cleopatra would eventually hear the story in pieces. First that Pompey had lost, then that he had fled to Egypt, then that he had been murdered on landing. Each fragment reshaped the board on which she was forced to play. The brother whose ministers had driven her from Alexandria was now bound by an irreversible deed to the strongest Roman alive. Caesar came in his turn, following the trail eastward over restless waters. When his ships appeared near Alexandria, he was not arriving as a conqueror with overwhelming force. He brought only a limited contingent, veteran legionaries, but not enough to overawe an entire kingdom. He came quickly, as if still in pursuit of Pompey, intent on finishing a war that spilled across coasts and borders. The entrance into Alexandria was less a triumphal march than a careful insertion into a place that did not quite know how to receive him. Alexandria did not resemble the Roman towns Caesar knew. It was newer than Rome, but in some ways older in its self-understanding. A planned city laid out by Alexander, finished by his successors, accustomed for centuries to see itself as a capital of knowledge, trade, and royal ceremony. It had its own pride, its own memories of foreign generals and their temporary commands. Now Roman boots rang on Egyptian stone, and the city tightened around them. Accounts of those first days are thin and mostly Roman, but we can imagine the textures. The harbour thick with voices in many languages, shipmasters muttering about new arrivals, merchants considering whether to hide their best goods or display them. In the narrow streets, Alexandrians watched the unfamiliar discipline of Roman formations moving between warehouses and official lodgings, shields catching the low sun. Temple courtyards and council halls hummed with argument. Some saw Caesar as a guarantor of order, a chance to stabilise the government and assure the continued flow of grain exports on which Egypt's economy and Rome's hunger depended. Others saw only danger. A foreign general whose victories had just broken the Roman Republic's balance might now decide the fate of their own king. Caesar carried with him not only military skill, but a set of very specific concerns. He wanted peace in the east, so that he could return to Rome without another major war smouldering on his flank. He wanted the debts owed by Egypt paid, or at least properly structured, to refill Roman coffers, and to demonstrate that loyalty to him would be tangibly rewarded. He wanted control, perhaps not outright annexation, not yet, but a dependable grip on a kingdom whose grain could feed or starve the Roman populace. Pompey's severed head was brought to him as if it would smooth all this work. The stories agree that Caesar did not respond as his hosts expected. Even allowing for later embellishment, there is a consistent note of distaste, even grief, in the Roman reports. Pompey had been his son-in-law, once his ally. He was also, beyond any personal bond, a great Roman whose end in foreign shallows felt to Caesar like an affront to Roman dignity itself. The Egyptian ministers had misunderstood something essential. They imagined that in civil war all bonds dissolved, that the victor would be glad to see a rival eliminated by any means. Caesar, steeped in the rituals and myths of his city, felt instead that only Romans should decide the ultimate fate of a Roman of such rank. The killing of Pompey was meant as a gesture of submission. To Caesar, it was an awkward stain that called for chastening, not gratitude. From that miscalculation came a tightening of his resolve to intervene more directly. He installed himself in the royal palace district, taking up quarters near the young Ptolemy XIII, whom he now treated less as an independent monarch and more as a ward whose actions required supervision. He sent messages to the court, to the priesthoods, to the financial officials, making it clear that Rome's chief commander had not simply come to accept a gift and sail away. He ordered that the terms of Ptolemy XII's will be read and honoured, a will that had named both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII as co-rulers under Roman protection. In this legal gesture lay a subtle but decisive statement. Egypt's internal power struggle would be judged by Roman eyes. The exiled queen, whose name had been carefully scrubbed from decrees, was suddenly relevant again to the man who commanded legions on her soil. Outside the palace complex, in the crowded quarters and along the canals, Alexandrians lived with a low, constant tension. There were not yet pitched battles, but there were arguments that ended with fists on doorsteps, jostling in marketplaces when a Roman soldier pushed through too roughly, watchful silences in the wine shops near the barracks. The city could feel that something delicate had shifted. Their boy king's guardians now shared the capital not only with their internal enemies, but with a foreign general who claimed the authority to arbitrate between them. For Cleopatra, still away from Alexandria, the arrival of Caesar was a double-edged signal. On one edge lay opportunity. Here was the man whose name had once secured her father's throne, the arbiter before whom her father had set down a will that confirmed her as queen. Caesar's insistence on honouring that document meant that, at least in principle, he recognised her claim. With Roman power now physically present in Alexandria, Pothinus and Achillas could no longer simply ignore her existence. Their neat erasure of her name from decrees had been interrupted by a larger script. On the other edge lay danger of a different magnitude. Caesar was not a disinterested judge. He was a commander with clear material aims, and Egypt was heavy with the very resources he sought. To approach him was to step into the sphere of a man whose victories had already broken one ancient political order. He could restore a queen, or reduce her to a client, or worse, if she ceased to be useful. In the quiet spaces of her camp, perhaps by lamplight among maps and letters, Cleopatra would have weighed these edges with the same care she had once applied to philosophical arguments and astronomical charts. To remain distant was to accept eclipse, to let her brother's faction and Caesar settle Egypt's fate between them. To approach was to risk becoming a piece in a game whose centre lay in Rome, not Alexandria. The reports from the city sharpened the urgency. Caesar had summoned both royal siblings to appear before him and resolve their dispute. The boy king was already there, surrounded by advisors who whispered their own version of events into Roman ears. If Cleopatra did not stand in that same room, with her own voice, her own documents, her own reading of their father's will, the story of Egypt's crisis would solidify without her. The sea breeze from Alexandria carried more than the smell of salt and incense now. It carried the sound of marching feet, the rustle of new standards in palace halls, the murmur of Roman Latin blending uneasily with Greek and Egyptian. Beneath it all ran a subtler current, the sense that a moment had arrived which, if seized, might transform exile into restoration, and if misjudged, might entangle Egypt in a web from which no Ptolemy could fully escape. Caesar had come to Egypt seeking conclusion, the end of Pompey's threat, the regular payment of debts, the assurance of a quiet eastern flank. What he found instead was a kingdom in the midst of its own unresolved struggle, and a queen on the horizon whose arrival would turn his search for order into a new and intricate entanglement. In the narrow space between those intentions and that reality, Cleopatra began to move. Cleopatra did not walk openly back through the city gates. To come in full procession would have been to invite interception, by her brother's soldiers, by hostile ministers, perhaps even by Roman officers unsure of which sibling should be recognized first. Instead, later traditions describe her return in different shades of secrecy. Some Roman authors tell a story of her being smuggled into the palace rolled in a carpet or concealed in bedding, an image that has lingered for centuries precisely because it is so vivid. Whether or not the details are exact, the core pattern seems plausible. Cleopatra slipped back into Alexandria not as a triumphant queen, but as a claimant moving carefully through a city already crowded with foreign soldiers. She knew that her first battle would not be on the streets, but in the chambers where Caesar now listened. In those halls, lit perhaps by oil lamps that picked out the gold on painted ceilings, Caesar had set himself up as an arbiter of dynastic quarrels. The boy king Ptolemy XIII appeared with his circle of advisors, Pothinus the regent, Achillas the general, and Theodotus the rhetoric teacher, each ready to explain why Cleopatra's exclusion from power had been necessary, why her name had been erased from official life. Into this atmosphere Cleopatra entered, not as a supplicant in chains, but as a co-ruler named in a royal will recognized by Rome itself. The scene, as later writers reconstruct it, is one of words sharpened into weapons. Documents were read, interpretations argued over, clauses of her father's arrangements weighed in the balance. Cleopatra could speak fluent Greek, the language of administration and law in Alexandria, and she understood the Roman habits of legalism well enough to play to them. She presented herself not as a rebellious exile begging restoration, but as the rightful partner in a joint kingship, unlawfully pushed aside. In this framing, Caesar did not need to pick a new favourite so much as enforce an existing Roman-approved settlement. It was a subtle but important shift. She invited him to see his involvement not as an intrusion into Egyptian sovereignty, but as the fulfilment of a Roman obligation. Behind the legal phrases ran currents of more immediate concern. Caesar needed money. Cleopatra controlled or could promise to control revenues. Caesar needed stability. Cleopatra offered, at least in her rhetoric, a disciplined administration, rather than a court split by competing regents. She could remind him, quietly but firmly, that her father's loyalty to Rome had been rewarded not by disaster, but by renewed security, a pattern she was prepared to repeat. Around that central negotiation, the city itself grew restless. Pothinus and his faction quickly grasped that Caesar's sympathetic hearing of Cleopatra was a threat not only to their influence but to their safety. Roman accounts suggest that they began to plot in response, reaching out to garrisons and commanders still loyal to their version of the young king. Achillas, the general who had arranged Pompey's assassination, emerged as the sharp edge of this resistance. In the streets and alleys of Alexandria, the tension that had hummed beneath daily life began to surface. Soldiers loyal to the king's ministers drifted closer to the palace district. Roman detachments took to patrolling with greater alertness, shields held a fraction higher, hands resting more firmly on spear shafts. Alexandrian citizens watched from shaded doorways as two centres of power overlapped within their city, one native, one foreign, and understood that they might soon be asked, or forced, to choose between them. The first clashes were not yet full battles. They were ambushes in narrow streets, sudden skirmishes at corners where sightlines broke, stones thrown from rooftops, a javelin loosed from behind a colonnade. Caesar's troops, seasoned but outnumbered, felt the dangerous geometry of fighting in a city not designed for legions. Long lines and open fields could not protect them here. Every lane was a potential trap. When open hostility could no longer be disguised, Achilles moved decisively. With forces estimated by ancient writers to be many times larger than the Roman contingent, though numbers are uncertain, he advanced on the palace quarter, aiming to isolate Caesar, seize Ptolemy XIII, and recast the terms of Roman involvement at sword point. Caesar responded by turning the palace and its attached harbour facilities into a fortress. He ordered nearby buildings secured, walls strengthened, vantage points occupied. The royal quarter, with its gardens and colonnades, became an improvised military camp. Cleopatra, restored to the centre of power in name, if not yet in fact, now lived within a compound ringed by men ready for close combat, the murmurs of political debate replaced by the harsher sounds of preparation. The struggle for Alexandria unfolded in layers. At ground level, there were desperate fights in the harbour, where control of the quays and anchorages meant the difference between isolation and resupply. Roman ships, few but well handled, manoeuvred against Egyptian vessels in cramped waters. Boarding actions took place almost within sight of the palace verandas. Some sources describe burning ships drifting through the harbour, their rigging crackling, the air heavy with smoke and salt. In the streets beyond, Alexandrian fighters who sided with the king's faction harried Roman patrols and any known supporters of Cleopatra. The city's famous grid of avenues and cross streets became a chessboard where each intersection mattered. Each marketplace might suddenly blossom into violence. Higher still, above the noise, decisions were made in rooms where Cleopatra and Caesar shared not only strategy, but risk. She understood the city better than he did, the moods of its population, the loyalties of its priesthoods, the complex relationship between Greek-speaking elites and the older Egyptian cults. While ancient Roman writers tend to focus on Caesar's role, some modern historians suggest that Cleopatra's knowledge of local dynamics would have been invaluable in judging where to apply pressure, whom to win over, and which districts could be relied on to stay quiet. Under this strain, the uneasy alliance between Caesar and Cleopatra hardened into mutual dependence. He could not hope to hold Alexandria without at least a portion of Egyptian administrative support. She could not hope to reclaim her throne without his professional soldiers. What had begun as a negotiation in lamplight became, under the glare of fires, a shared project of survival. Out of this crucible came one of history's most debated episodes, the burning near the library complex. During the fighting around the harbour, Caesar ordered ships set ablaze to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The flames leapt from vessel to vessel and, according to several ancient sources, spread to adjacent dockside structures and storehouses. Some later writers, drawing on these reports, concluded that the fire leapt still further, damaging or even destroying parts of the Great Library of Alexandria. Modern scholars differ on the extent of this destruction. Some suggest that only warehouses containing books destined for the library were burned, not the main complex itself. Others argue that if the library buildings did suffer damage, they were later repaired or partly restored, given that references to Alexandrian scholarship continue after Caesar's time. The sources are fragmentary, coloured by hindsight, and by the desire to attach a single dramatic moment to the long, gradual story of the library's decline. What seems clear is that the Alexandrian War did not touch only soldiers and rulers. The fires, wherever exactly they spread, consumed more than timber and sailcloth. They likely destroyed records, goods, and perhaps scrolls. Human labour slowly gathered over years, gone in hours. In a city that had prided itself on being a sanctuary of knowledge, the sight of smoke rising near that quarter must have carried a particular sting. As the conflict dragged on, the pattern of alliances shifted again. Reinforcements eventually reached Caesar, additional troops sent from abroad, perhaps from Asia Minor or nearby garrisons, answering his urgent dispatches. With these new forces, and with segments of the population either cowed or persuaded into neutrality, the balance began to tilt. Pothinus was captured and executed. Achilles, too, was removed from the scene, his military challenge broken. Ptolemy XIII, for all the royal titles attached to his name, had less room to manoeuvre than his ministers. Some accounts describe him attempting to flee or regroup, only to meet his death near the Nile, drowned in waters that had for centuries both nourished and threatened the land his ancestors claimed. Cleopatra emerged from this chaos not as a passive beneficiary, but as a figure who had navigated peril at every level: physical, political, and symbolic. She was restored as queen, now officially co-ruling with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, in a display of dynastic continuity. Yet the formality of joint reign could not fully conceal the deeper truth. Her position was now bound tight to Roman power. Rome, in turn, was no longer a stable patron. Caesar returned there still at odds with many in the Senate. His concentration stretched between distant provinces and conspiracies at home. To be tied to his fortunes was to be tied to a ship sailing through stormy waters. In Alexandria, the streets that had seen blood and flame slowly settled back into their layered rhythms. Markets reopened, scholars returned to their texts, temple rituals resumed. But the memory of Roman soldiers in the palace, of fires near the harbour, of a queen whose restoration had required foreign steel, lingered beneath the surface. Cleopatra had reclaimed her capital and her title. She had done so by aligning herself with the most powerful Roman alive, in a city that had learned how quickly the fortunes of such men could turn. The lamps of Alexandria burned again into the night, reflecting off calm water that had recently held wreckage and war. Somewhere within the palace complex, Cleopatra would have known that her own future, and that of her kingdom, was now intertwined with a republic that was quietly, inexorably, becoming something else. In the months that followed, Cleopatra faced a task that was in some ways more delicate than surviving a siege. Victory in Alexandria had made her queen again, but it had also exposed how fragile her position truly was. She ruled a kingdom whose sovereignty had been bartered and rebartered with Rome, whose treasury had been drained by decades of tribute and loans, whose elites were divided by language, custom, and cult. The fires had died down, yet the fundamental question remained: on what exactly could her rule safely rest? She needed, above all else, stability. For an Egyptian monarch, stability began with lineage. The Ptolemaic house was foreign in origin, Macedonian Greeks grafted onto the older trunk of the Nile Valley. For 3 centuries they had worked, in varying degrees, to present themselves as legitimate heirs to the pharaohs, taking traditional titles, patronising temples, appearing in reliefs dressed as the ancient kings had been, offering to the gods of Upper and Lower Egypt. But civil war and repeated interventions from Rome had frayed that carefully woven fabric. Cleopatra understood that the past alone would not carry her forward. She required 3 converging forms of support: the formal legitimacy of dynastic continuity, the deeper, almost spiritual endorsement of the Egyptian priesthoods and populace, and the practical recognition of the Roman state. It is in this context that the birth of a child acquired its sharpest political meaning. Somewhere in the later months after the Alexandrian War, ancient sources do not agree on every detail, Cleopatra bore a son. She named him Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar. To Egyptians, he could be presented as the next Ptolemy, another link in the chain of kings. To Greeks, his additional epithets, beloved of his father, beloved of his mother, sounded like traditional dynastic piety. But in the Roman world, one part of his name towered above the rest: Caesar. Later writers, especially those hostile to Cleopatra, would claim that she announced the boy as Julius Caesar's son and heir. Roman officialdom never accepted him in that role. Caesar himself, so far as our sources record, did not publicly acknowledge the child in the formal, legalistic way that Roman inheritance law would have required. But Cleopatra's choice of name was not an accident, and neither was the way she began to have herself and her son portrayed. In Egypt, she could now appear with him in temple reliefs as a mother king, leading her small co-ruler by the hand into the presence of the gods. The boy's very existence allowed her to embody continuity twice over. She was the daughter of Auletes, the late king whose will Rome had endorsed, and she was the mother of a new generation in which Egyptian and Roman fortunes seemed, symbolically at least, intertwined. This child, whom later ages would call Caesarion Little Caesar, became more than a baby in a royal nursery. He was a concept given human form, a living argument that Caesar's immense power and her ancient crown were not separate stories but strands of one design. Cleopatra expanded that design through how she governed and how she appeared. In official Egyptian contexts, she presented herself not merely as a Greek dynast ruling a foreign land, but as pharaoh in her own right. In hieroglyphic inscriptions, her titles invoked Mayat, the principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order that pharaohs were charged with upholding. She was depicted making offerings to deities who had watched over the Nile for thousands of years, her image aligned with a long gallery of predecessors whose names were carved into stone. At the same time, she worked to renew the compact between crown and country that had been strained by debt and foreign policy. Temple estates, long central to the economic and spiritual health of Egypt, received attention and support. Taxation, though still heavy under the burdens imposed by Roman demands, could be calibrated in ways designed to keep the agricultural machine running and the priesthoods at least partly appeased. Where the record is fragmentary, historians infer patterns. Grain must flow, canals must be maintained, rituals must be funded. A queen who let these things falter would soon find the image of prosperity slipping from her grasp. To the people of the Nile Valley, the most convincing argument for a ruler's legitimacy was the behaviour of the land itself. If the inundation came at the right height and time, if the fields yielded, if bread was obtainable in the markets, then the gods, it seemed, had not turned away. Cleopatra's policies aimed to bind her reign to such visible signs of order and plenty. The image of her as protector of prosperity was not only carved in relief, it was meant to be felt in the price of grain and the hum of daily work. Yet this carefully tended equilibrium could not be secured within Egypt alone. Rome still loomed over every calculation. The Senate and the armies, the financiers and governors, held the power to confirm or unsettle the arrangements her father had made. Caesar had placed her back on the throne, and as long as he lived, his patronage formed a kind of invisible shield around her. But that shield was anchored not in Alexandria's harbours, but in the turbulent politics of a distant city. Cleopatra travelled there to reinforce the connection. A visit to Rome placed her at the heart of a world in transition. The city that greeted her was not the marble capital of later emperors, but a crowded, energetic, sometimes uneasy place of brick and timber, of competing factions and sharp resentments. She lodged, it seems, on the estate across the Tiber that had belonged to Caesar, in a position both close to and slightly removed from the official centres of Roman power. The contrast with Alexandria would have been immediate. Here, the language of public life was Latin, not Greek. The Senate met not in a refined Hellenistic palace, but in buildings heavy with ancestral memories. Instead of the religious blend of Egyptian and Greek cults, she walked among temples raised to Jupiter and Juno, her debates about omens interpreted through a Roman lens. Her presence itself was politically charged. Some Romans, especially those in Caesar's circle, likely regarded her with calculated respect. A valuable client queen, ruler of an important grain supply, a symbol of Caesar's reach. Others found her position troubling. A foreign sovereign, treated with honour, associated, perhaps too closely, with a man whose accumulation of titles had already stirred fears that the Republic was being hollowed out. Cleopatra moved through this environment with care. She watched Senate debates, observed the rituals that framed Roman public life, learned how Caesar presented himself to his own people. The stories suggest that she paid attention not only to formal politics, but to the more elusive currents of opinion, how common Romans talked about wealth and power, how they reacted to building projects, to new laws, to the inscriptions that announced Caesar's acts. For a queen whose future depended on Roman decisions, this was more than curiosity. It was research. In Rome, she could also let the idea of Caesarion, present or in distant Alexandria, do a quiet kind of work. His name, whispered in certain circles, hinted at a possible bridge between East and West. Yet such suggestions also sharpened anxieties. An heir born of a foreign queen touched deep nerves in a society whose leading men still spoke the language of republican tradition, even as monarchic realities crept closer. The tension thickened around Caesar in those months. Honours accumulated, statues rose, a calendar was reformed to carry his name. The line between first citizen and king, once firm in theory, seemed to blur in practice. Cleopatra, who had seen how fragile royal authority could be, even when shored up by ancient rituals, watched a different kind of monarchy half-forming in a city that still told itself it had no kings. Then, suddenly, the careful structures collapsed. On a day in March, in the year we now call 44 BCE, Caesar walked into a meeting of the Senate and did not walk out alive. Knives in a crowded hall cut not only the man but the network of expectations that had gathered around him. The patrons he had protected, the enemies he had intimidated, the allies who had tied their fortunes to his, each found the path ahead turning in an instant into something unclear. News of his assassination reached Cleopatra not as a single, clean report, but as a confusion of messages and rumours. Who was responsible? What would the army do? Would the old Republican order reassert itself? Or would a new struggle break out for control of the state he had reshaped? For Cleopatra, the implications were stark. The Roman recognition that had underpinned her title, the personal relationship that had seemed to anchor her kingdom's future, the name she had given her son, all were suddenly cast into uncertainty. The shield she had relied upon vanished in a flurry of blades far from the Nile, and the world which she had worked so carefully to steady reopened into chaos. From the calm surfaces of the Tiber to the deep, slow waters of the Nile, a tremor ran through the Mediterranean. The question that had haunted her father's reign returned in a new form. When Rome entered crisis, what became of those who lived in its shadow? The answer would draw Cleopatra back toward Alexandria and into a new phase of struggle, this time not beside Caesar, but in the fractured landscape left in the wake of his death. In the hours and days after the Ides of March, the centre of gravity in the Roman world seemed to dissolve. No one, in those first moments, knew what would follow. The conspirators who had killed Caesar claimed to have restored liberty, but liberty in Rome was not an abstract condition. It depended on legions, on patronage networks, on the mood of the crowd in the forum. Those could not be summoned by slogans alone. Caesar's veterans, scattered in colonies and encampments, heard of his death with anger, grief and confusion. Some had been promised land, others future commands. The guarantor of those promises now lay on a blood-darkened Senate floor. In the city, ordinary Romans who had depended on Caesar's distributions of grain and spectacle struggled to understand what this freedom meant if it brought with it the possibility of hunger. The men who had wielded the knives found, very quickly, that they had not simply cut away a tyrant. They had torn open a structure that had been holding many competing ambitions in a tense temporary balance. Into the space left behind, new configurations of power began, almost at once, to take shape. From Cleopatra's vantage point, the pattern was difficult to read, but its danger was obvious. The political world in which she had been operating, one in which Caesar's favour could protect her, one in which alliances could be structured around his singular authority, no longer existed. In its place stood a twisting, unstable landscape. Rivalries that had been held in check while Caesar lived now pushed to the surface. Men who had served under him, or alongside him, asked themselves whether the Republic could truly be restored, or whether some new form of rule would emerge, one they might try to guide, or even embody. In this uncertain air, Cleopatra made a cautious choice. She did not remain in Rome to become a symbol on one side of a developing civil conflict, nor did she loudly assert any claim for her son in the immediate wake of Caesar's death. Instead, she retreated, geographically but not mentally, from the epicenter of the storm. The journey back to Egypt would have unfolded along routes that had carried armies and grain, letters and luxuries for generations. Ships slipped down the Tiber toward the sea, then traced the curves of the Italian coast, the rocky shores of Greece, the islands that dotted the Aegean. From there, the course bent toward the Levantine harbours, and finally southward to the mouth of the Nile. Somewhere between fading Italian hills and the first scent of Nile silt, Cleopatra's task became clearer. She would have to re-evaluate every assumption about how Egypt related to Rome. The sea gave way to river water, slower and more familiar. Barges moved against the current, pushed by labourers who knew each bend by heart. Villages came into view, then slipped behind, their evening fires glowing briefly like small constellations along the banks. The calmness of this landscape could deceive an unwary eye. Underneath it lay the same truth that had shaped her father's reign and her own. Egypt did not exist in isolation. It fed directly into Rome's survival. By the time she reached Alexandria, reports had begun to solidify into a rough outline. Caesar's will, read in Rome, named as his adopted son and principal heir a young man who, until then, had stood slightly apart from the first rank of political actors, Gaius Octavius, whom history would remember as Octavian. Though only in his late teens, he suddenly found himself endowed with Caesar's name, a portion of his wealth, and, more importantly, a claim to the loyalty of those who had followed Caesar in life. Another figure quickly emerged as central, Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony, who had been one of Caesar's key lieutenants, and for a time co-consul. Charismatic, experienced in war and wrapped in his own web of obligations and resentments, Antony manoeuvred to position himself as the natural inheritor of Caesar's political capital, if not in law, then in fact. Around them, the remnants of the Republican establishment tried to reassert themselves. Senators who had feared Caesar's dominance now spoke once more in the language of shared governance and ancestral custom. But their authority depended on the same forces everyone else coveted: armories, treasuries, and the willingness of men to follow orders shouted above the clamour. From Alexandria, the picture resolved into something like a tripod, each leg straining against the others. Antony, with his military background and connection to Caesar's memory; Octavian, with his freshly granted name and the aura of legal inheritance; and a fragile, wounded republic whose institutions still commanded reverence, even as they risked becoming vessels for new forms of personal rule. For Cleopatra, each of these emerging elements posed both a threat and an opportunity. Antony knew Egypt's importance from his time in Caesar's circle. Octavian, though young, could not be expected to ignore a kingdom whose grain ships had long helped stabilize Roman politics by preventing famine. The Senate, if it managed to re-establish a measure of control, might revisit every arrangement Caesar had made, including those concerning client kings and queens. In theory, Cleopatra might have tried to declare a kind of neutrality, to withdraw from Roman contests and focus on internal Egyptian matters. In practice, that was almost impossible. Egypt's wealth was too conspicuous. Its ports, especially Alexandria, were too strategic. Its grain, reliably harvested from black earth renewed each year by the Nile's inundation, was a resource that every Roman faction could imagine harnessing. Whoever controlled Egypt's output, or at least its goodwill, could claim a powerful lever over the city on the Tiber, where empty granaries could turn political debates into riots. So the queen, who had once needed one Roman to secure her throne, now found herself in a world where many Romans, of differing loyalties, might attempt to secure her instead. She responded with restraint and listening. In the marble halls and columned courtyards of Alexandria, rumour became an everyday presence. Messengers arrived along desert roads from Syria and Judea, bringing news of skirmishes, speeches, sudden shifts of alliance. Other couriers came by river, docking discreetly in the inner harbours, bearing letters whose seals were broken only in the most private of chambers. Within the court, voices stirred the air with urgent suggestions. Some nobles, remembering the ruinous costs of past interventions, counselled distance from Roman quarrels. Others argued that choosing the likely victor early might spare Egypt future demands and punishments. The priesthoods, mindful of Egypt's own rhythms, wanted assurances that whatever path the queen chose would not disrupt the pilgrimage routes, the temple endowments, the rituals that synchronized heaven and earth. Cleopatra moved among these currents with deliberate calm. She had survived exile, civil war, and the volatile intimacy of an alliance with Caesar. Those experiences had taught her that acting too soon could be as dangerous as acting too late. Information became her first priority. She needed to know which armies had actually moved, which promises had materialized into coin and grain, which men were loved or hated by the soldiers whose loyalty would decide the future. At night, Alexandria lay under its canopy of lamps, the phosphorescent line of the Pharaohs lighthouse still carving a path through the dark sea. Within the palace, maps were unrolled, letters reread, names weighed. Egypt's past, its long memory of foreign invaders and local dynasties, pressed quietly around her. Again and again, the same question formed beneath different words. If the world was tilting, in which direction and at what speed? Far to the west, on roads lined with cypress and in camps that smelled of dust and iron, Antony and Octavian were sketching their own answers in alliances and edicts. The Republic, bruised but not yet broken beyond recognition, tried to accommodate them. The experiment would not be stable. Soon the shifting balance in Rome would send new envoys eastward, carrying propositions, threats, and invitations. When that moment came, Cleopatra would no longer be choosing how to stand beside a single dominant Roman. She would be deciding how Egypt itself would be positioned between competing visions of what Rome could become. The desert waited beyond the cultivated valley, vast and indifferent. The river flowed on, bearing barges heavy with grain toward the Mediterranean. Between these two immensities in the layered city at the Nile's mouth, a queen watched the western horizon and prepared, with careful patience, for the next figure who would step out of Rome's turmoil and into her story. By the time the dust of the next Roman civil war began to settle, the outline of a new arrangement had taken shape. The men who had fought over Caesar's legacy, Antony, Octavian, and a third commander Lepidus, agreed, at least on the surface, to share power. Their compromise was not the old republic, nor yet an open monarchy, but something in between, a formal partnership known to later ages as the Second Triumvirate. In practical terms, this meant division. Octavian would focus on Italy and the western provinces, where veteran settlements, land distributions, and the uneasy loyalty of the Roman people required constant attention. Lepidus occupied a more marginal position. His influence centered in parts of Africa. Antony took the east, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and the lands that looked out toward the Euphrates and beyond. On official tablets, this arrangement could be written as a set of territories, but that simplicity was misleading. The East was not a quiet inheritance. It was a broad, intricate theatre of ongoing wars, restive cities, overlapping royal houses and long simmering disputes. It was also where Rome expected to find much of the money, manpower and supplies that would sustain the triumvir's future ambitions. Antony understood this. His own strength had never rested solely on law. It lay in the loyalty of soldiers, in the ability to reward friends and punish rivals, in the living network of patrons and clients that made Roman politics possible. To maintain that network, to recruit and pay legions, he needed what the East could offer: tribute from cities, taxes from provinces, and the cooperation, or at least the acquiescence, of the region's kings and queens. From Alexandria, Cleopatra watched the balance shift. The man who now held authority over Rome's eastern sphere was no distant abstraction. She had seen Antony in Rome, had observed the mixture of boldness and calculation that made him both formidable and unpredictable. He knew Egypt's importance as well. He had seen, during Caesar's time, how the grain ships from the Nile could soothe or inflame the Roman populace. For a while, their paths did not directly cross. Antony had immediate crises to manage. Parthian forces pressed at Rome's eastern frontier. Cities in Greece and Asia expected attention. Allies needed reassurance that the new order, however improvised, would protect their interests. Cleopatra in turn had her own delicate work to perform, restoring stability after her absence, managing local politics, tending to the fragile equilibrium between Egyptian traditions and Greek administrative structures. Yet their spheres of necessity drew steadily closer. Antony could not conduct campaigns in the east without secure supply lines and reliable partners. The Parthian Empire to the east of Syria and Mesopotamia represented not just a military challenge but a test of Roman prestige. Successful operations against Parthia would require more than bravery. They would demand logistics on a vast scale: grain for soldiers, pay for auxiliaries, equipment, animals, ships, and the steady flow of coin that turned intention into action. Egypt, standing at the southeastern edge of Antony's assigned domain, offered many of these things in concentrated form. Its harvests, nourished by the Nile rather than the unpredictable Mediterranean rains, were comparatively reliable. Its treasury, though strained by past debts and the costs of earlier conflicts, still possessed reserves that few other kingdoms could match. Its fleet, its ports, and its administrative system could move goods and information with a precision that came from centuries of practice. From Cleopatra's perspective, the emergence of Antony as master of the East brought both risk and opportunity into sharper focus. If he succeeded in his enterprises and consolidated power, any ruler in his orbit who had remained aloof or antagonistic might find themselves exposed. If he failed, the upheaval could spread along trade routes and frontiers, threatening Egypt's own stability. Neutrality in such a context was less a fixed posture than a temporary condition, one that might be misunderstood or overridden by events. The first significant overture came not in Alexandria, but in a city further north, Tarsus in Cilicia, near the southern coast of Asia Minor. Tarsus was an old city, where Greek, Anatolian and Eastern influences mingled. At this moment in history, it also became a kind of stage. Antony had summoned Eastern rulers and envoys there in order to reorganize the region, reward some, chastise others, and demonstrate that the East now had a Roman overseer who intended to be obeyed. Among those he called was the Queen of Egypt. The invitation, part command, part test, travelled over land and sea, carried by messengers who moved along well-worn routes. Its subtext was clear enough. Cleopatra was expected to present herself, to account for her conduct during the previous conflicts, and to position Egypt within Antony's expanding framework of alliances and obligations. She did not ignore the summons, nor did she approach it as a simple submission. For Cleopatra, the journey to Tarsus was not just a physical relocation, it was a carefully planned diplomatic performance. She knew that Antony's needs were immediate and pressing. His Parthian plans demanded resources he did not fully possess. His soldiers, accustomed to Caesar's generosity, would not tolerate long periods without pay. His prominence in the Triumvirate, though considerable, was not beyond challenge. Octavian watched from the west, tallying every success and failure, attuned to any sign that Antony was overextended or vulnerable. These pressures gave Cleopatra leverage. If she moved with precision, she could offer what Antony sought: grain, money, ships, perhaps even auxiliary forces, but not as tribute squeezed from a subordinate. In her calculation, Egypt's support must come in the form of negotiated partnership, anchored in mutual benefit and formalized through titles, territories, and guarantees. To achieve this, she had to control not only the content of her proposals, but the setting in which they were received. The sources that describe her arrival in Tarsus linger on details of display, but beneath the embellishments, another layer is discernible. Cleopatra understood that in a world saturated with rumour, image was not ornament. It was a tool of statecraft. The impression she created among the assembled dignitaries would circulate far beyond that particular city, shaping how other rulers and even common soldiers spoke of Egypt and its queen. She needed Antony to see her not as a supplicant clinging to Roman favour, but as a sovereign whose cooperation could stabilise his eastern command. In this light, the meeting at Tarsus appears less as a scene from a private drama, and more as a summit between two political actors who each brought their own pressures, expectations and calculations to the same table. Antony, facing vast campaigns and limited coffers, required dependable Eastern allies. Cleopatra, ruling a wealthy but exposed kingdom, required a Roman partner who could shield Egypt from annexation and internal meddling. Between them lay the question of terms. Security for Egypt was one side of the equation. Cleopatra sought explicit confirmations of her rule, recognition of her son's position, and perhaps the possibility of extending or consolidating Ptolemaic influence in neighbouring regions if circumstances allowed. Stability for Antony's operations was the other side. With Egypt's support, he could present himself to his soldiers and to Rome as the man who had transformed a volatile frontier into a source of strength. And above or beneath both sets of aims, Rome's wars continued to demand money. Coin would travel westward from the cities of Asia, from client kingdoms, and, if agreement was reached, from Egypt's treasuries as well. In exchange, Cleopatra would expect that those in Rome who counted such flows would also count Egypt among the indispensable partners of the new regime, not as a prize waiting to be seized. The conversations at Tarsus, whose exact words are lost, likely moved along these lines. Questions of tribute framed as alliance, questions of allegiance framed as mutual defence, questions of appearance, how support would be described in decrees and letters, framed as matters of honour. Cleopatra entered those talks with a clear sense of her priorities. She had not survived the convulsions of Caesar's era to become a passive figurehead under Antony. The tools she brought were those she had refined over years: acute listening, careful reading of character, a command of languages and precedent, and an ability to match gesture to message so that each reinforced the other. In the quiet intervals between formal receptions and consultations, as night settled over Tarsus and the sounds of the river, and the city softened into a low murmur, the outline of a new alignment took shape. It would not be a simple repetition of her earlier relationship with Caesar. The world had changed. The western half of the Triumvirate was held by another man entirely. The memory of recent wars hung over every promise. Yet once again, the fate of Egypt and the ambitions of a leading Roman were drawing together. From the vantage point of Alexandria, this was not surrender to a larger power, but a deliberate attempt to place Egypt in a position where it could survive, and perhaps even shape, the storms still gathering in the distance. The understanding reached in Tarsus did not remain a set of spoken assurances. Slowly, over months and then years, it hardened into an architecture of alliance, visible in documents, in coinage, in the arrangement of armies and councils, in the lives of children who would never remember a world before Antony and Cleopatra joined their fortunes. On the surface, the partnership could be described in simple terms. Cleopatra supplied money, grain, and ships. Antony supplied protection, recognition, and the weight of Roman authority. Yet the reality was more intricate, webbed through everyday governance and long-range planning. In Alexandria, the Queen's court became one of the central nerve centres of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Treasury officials, trained in the precise methodical traditions of Ptolemaic bookkeeping, tracked the arrival of revenues from Egypt's Kora, the countryside nourished by the Nile's flood, as well as customs dues from harbours and taxes from towns. They also began to factor in new obligations, payments pledged to Antony's campaigns, special subsidies for veterans, emergency funds set aside for contingencies along Rome's eastern frontier. Cleopatra did not simply open the coffers and let others decide. Surviving hints in the sources suggest that she involved herself closely in financial planning, weighing how much Egypt could provide without crippling its own internal stability. Coinage issued during these years speaks in its quiet metal language of shared priorities. Antony's image on some issues, Cleopatra's or their children's on others, Greek legends, Egyptian symbols, and references to victories or divine favour carefully combined. Military coordination followed a similar pattern. Roman legions remained under Antony's ultimate command, but the supply lines that fed them often ran through Egyptian-controlled nodes. Grain from the Nile Valley was directed to depots in Syria and along the coast. Egyptian ships escorted transports, patrolled sea lanes, and occasionally formed part of a larger fleets assembled for particular offensives. Cleopatra, who had watched Caesar fight for Alexandria street by street, understood how quickly war could erode a city's life. She therefore took an interest not only in what Egypt gave, but in how and when it was deployed. To support Antony's Parthian ambitions, she could provide auxiliary forces, archers from Crete, sailors from the Delta, specialists from the kingdom's diverse population, but she also insisted on maintaining Egypt's own garrisons and border defences. The alliance expanded Egypt's reach, but it also reinforced the idea that this was still a sovereign realm, not a mere armoury for Roman use. Within the palace, the rhythms of court administration adjusted to the new alignment. Envoys from Judea, Commagene, Cappadocia, Armenia, and other eastern kingdoms now encountered not only the familiar hierarchies of Ptolemaic officials, but also Roman centurions and Antony's advisors moving through the same corridors. Petitions might be addressed in Greek, answered with reference to Roman decrees, and sealed with Egyptian motifs invoking ancient gods. Cleopatra presided over this blend with deliberate care. Her reign had always rested on a balance: Greek bureaucratic efficiency layered upon older Egyptian institutions and religious traditions. The addition of Roman power could have unbalanced the whole structure. Instead, she worked to channel it, making Alexandria a place where Eastern rulers seeking Antony's favour often found themselves negotiating, at least in part, through her. The alliance was not only made of ledgers and orders, it took human form in the children born to Antony and Cleopatra. First came twins, a boy and a girl, whom the Greek-speaking world would know as Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and the moon, celestial names chosen with intention. Later a younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, joined them. Alongside Caesarion, Cleopatra's child by Julius Caesar, these children embodied an audacious idea that the future of the East might be organised around a blended dynasty, drawing its legitimacy from both pharaonic and Roman strands. In principle, dynastic planning in this region was nothing new. Clients and vassals had long married, adopted, and bestowed titles to weave alliances. But the scale of Cleopatra's vision, if later sources have preserved even a shadow of it, was unusual. She seems to have imagined not a single monolithic empire, but a constellation of interconnected thrones: Armenia, Syria, perhaps regions recovered from Parthia, or carved out of older Hellenistic domains, each governed by a child or relative, tied both to Egypt and to Rome's eastern commander. It was an attempt to turn the fragility of familial bonds into a network of loyalty, with Alexandria as one of its primary anchors. Regional rulers watched these developments with a mixture of calculation and unease. Some saw opportunity. Kings who had reason to fear rivals or internal dissent welcomed Antony's patronage and Cleopatra's favour. They received territories, titles, and the promise of powerful allies on 2 continents. Others, however, felt the weight of Egypt's renewed prominence. A wealthy, organised, and now openly Roman-aligned Alexandria could dominate trade routes, sway local politics, and overshadow older centres in Syria, Asia Minor, and beyond. In cities accustomed to thinking of themselves as heirs to Alexander the Great's legacy, the spectacle of Cleopatra claiming space as a central arbiter of Eastern affairs required adjustment. In Judea, in the small kingdoms of Anatolia, in the courts perched along the Taurus and Zagros mountains, councillors weighed how close they should stand to this expanding axis of power. The alliance reached one of its most visible expressions in a carefully staged series of ceremonies that later Romans would remember with particular suspicion, the so-called Donations of Alexandria. In these events, held in the great city that was Cleopatra's home, Antony and Cleopatra appeared in regal splendour before assembled crowds. Ancient accounts, filtered through hostile Roman eyes, describe them enthroned, dressed in garments associated with gods and legendary conquerors. More important than the fabrics, however, were the proclamations. Territories were announced and assigned. Caesarion was publicly declared the legitimate son of Julius Caesar, and given titles that linked him to Egypt and symbolically to the wider Hellenistic world. Alexander Helios was associated with lands to the east, possibly Armenia, Media, and regions that Rome still sought to secure. Cleopatra Selene was linked with Cyrenaica and parts of Africa. Ptolemy Philadelphus received recognition connected to Syria and Cilicia. These were not immediate transfers of full control. Antony did not own all the lands he ceremonially distributed. Rather, they were statements of intent, maps spoken aloud, sketching a future in which Cleopatra's dynasty, intertwined with Antony's authority, would preside over a revived Eastern Kingdom of Kingdoms. To many in Alexandria and the surrounding regions, the donations may have appeared as an impressive yet somewhat abstract theatre of honour. Titles and diadems had long been used to signal favour and project claims that might or might not be fully realised. But in Rome, news of the ceremony sounded different notes. Reports filtering back across the Mediterranean spoke of Antony sitting beside Cleopatra as an equal, of children not yet grown being styled as rulers of lands under Roman sway, of Caesarion being highlighted as Caesar's heir. For senators already wary of individual power, and for Octavian in particular, such gestures seemed to cross an invisible line. The donations suggested, at least in appearance, that Antony was willing to parcel out Rome's eastern possessions or aspirations as if they were his to dispose of, that he was elevating a foreign queen and her offspring to a status that rivaled or even surpassed Roman magistrates, that he was weaving together a parallel structure of prestige, with Alexandria as its ceremonial heart. Symbols in this world were never pure ornament. A title granted in a festival could become a pretext for future claims. A child acclaimed as King of Armenia might one day ride at the head of troops expecting that title to be treated as reality. A city that heard itself named as part of a queen's dowry might begin to orient its loyalties accordingly. Cleopatra understood the weight of such acts. When Antony bestowed crowns, she did not merely receive them. She incorporated those gestures into a long-standing Egyptian tradition in which the pharaoh's children, gods on earth in miniature, were associated with the 4 corners of the world, the 4 winds, the cyclical balance of sun and moon. The ancient language of dominion over the 2 lands and beyond could now be overlaid with Greek geographies and Roman frontiers. In the quiet after the ceremonies, when banners were folded away and torches extinguished, the alliance remained what it had always been, a structure of mutual need, bolstered by planned inheritances, sustained by ledgers and legions. But now it had outer walls made of ritual and proclamation, of names and imagined futures. From within those walls, Alexandria glowed with a renewed sense of centrality. From outside them, in Rome's forums and private dining rooms, some began to see not just a partnership but the outline of an Eastern monarchy that might one day stand as a rival to whatever order emerged in the West. Between those differing perceptions, the alliance continued to function, feeding armies, shaping diplomatic calculations, raising children who had been born into crowns that were promises as much as possessions. The architecture held for the moment. Yet in its very grandeur, In the careful stacking of titles and territories upon the shoulders of a few individuals, it contained the seeds of the anxieties that would soon be turned into weapons of accusation and war. In Rome, the man who would turn those anxieties into instruments of power was still, in some ways, an unlikely figure. Gaius Octavius, whom we usually call Octavian in this period, and later know as Augustus, did not dazzle with charisma in the way Caesar had, nor did he radiate the theatrical energy that drew men to Antony. His talent lay elsewhere, in patience, in a meticulous respect for legal forms, and in a cool, almost impersonal understanding that power in Rome depended as much on stories as on soldiers. He had learned early that brute force frightened the city, that open monarchy, or anything that looked like it, awakened memories of kings long ago driven out and of Julius Caesar struck down beneath the senators' knives. Octavian therefore made a discipline of never appearing to seize what he could instead be granted. Offices were voted to him, extraordinary commands were justified as temporary necessities, honours were framed as reluctant acceptances, taken for the good of the state. Around these careful gestures he built something quieter but no less formidable: control over the public narrative. He cultivated allies among Rome's orators and poets, men who could give his version of events a polished, memorable shape. He paid attention to how victories were described, how defeats were explained away, how enemies were named. In a republic where speeches, rumours and written accounts flowed through the forums and baths and porticos, this was a kind of invisible generalship. He did not command legions of stone and iron, but legions of words. When news of Antony and Cleopatra's ceremonies in Alexandria reached Rome, Octavian recognised at once the possibilities they offered. He did not have to invent Roman anxieties about Eastern wealth and luxury. Those fears already existed, woven into the city's self-image. Generations of Romans had cast themselves as disciplined, frugal, and morally upright in contrast to the imagined softness of the East, with its perfumes and silks, its banquets and monarchs reclining on couches of gold. The reality, as always, was more complex. Rome had long been entangled with Eastern kingdoms, shaped by their gods, philosophies, and trade, yet the stereotype persisted, ready to be used. Octavian began to present Antony not merely as a political rival, but as a man seduced and unmade by a foreign queen. In this telling, Cleopatra became the embodiment of all that Rome told itself it was not: luxurious where Rome was austere, absolute where Rome claimed to be republican, female and foreign in a culture that associated both womanhood and the East with softness, emotion, and a dangerous capacity to undermine male virtue. It is important to pause here, in the quiet of hindsight, and recognise how much of this picture is constructed. Most of what we know about Cleopatra and Antony in these years comes from Roman authors writing under or after the regime Octavian would eventually create. Their works preserve precious details, but they are also saturated with the political needs of their time. To justify civil war, to make sense of Romans killing Romans yet again, it helped to shift the centre of blame outward, toward Egypt, toward a queen whose intelligence and authority could be reframed as cunning and manipulation. Charges that Cleopatra bewitched Antony with luxury, that she softened his Roman virtues, tell us as much about Roman fears as they do about the two people at the heart of the story. A powerful woman who ruled in her own name, commanded fleets, and spoke to kings as an equal did not fit easily within Roman expectations. Gender and xenophobia braided together, traits admired in a male Roman general, decisiveness, ambition, a flair for spectacle, became threatening when attached to a Greek-speaking Egyptian queen. Octavian and his circle leaned into this discomfort. The donations of Alexandria, which in one frame were dynastic theatrics and diplomatic signalling, became in Roman speeches an almost treasonous act. Antony giving away Roman provinces to Cleopatra and to her children, Antony placing a diadem on Caesarion's head, and challenging Octavian's own claim to be Caesar's rightful heir. In the retelling, the subtleties of Hellenistic title-giving faded. What remained was an image of a consul of Rome, seated beside a queen, treating the empire's lands not as responsibilities entrusted to magistrates, but as gifts to be scattered among a foreign brood. Every element could be sharpened for effect. Cleopatra's wealth became excess. Her courtly refinement became decadence. Her skill in diplomacy became scheming. Her religious pageantry, rooted in millennia of Egyptian kingship, was shown to Roman audiences as audacious self-deification. Where she and Antony had tried to present a shared rulership to the Eastern Mediterranean, Octavian's messaging recast that vision as a rival monarchy, threatening to overshadow Rome itself. We have almost no Egyptian or Alexandrian accounts that might balance this view. Papyrus fragments, inscriptions, scattered references from later Greek writers. These are faint voices, easily drowned out by the Latin prose and poetry that survived in greater volume. When we read of Cleopatra hosting extravagant banquets, dissolving pearls, or pushing Antony into reckless schemes, we are often hearing echoes of Octavian's campaign, not neutral reporting. Behind those stories, another less dramatic possibility remains, that Antony and Cleopatra were engaged in the same hard, pragmatic work as any rulers of their age, securing borders, rewarding allies, planning for succession, and that their grandeur, though real, was no more excessive than the triumphal displays and lavish games staged in Rome itself. Yet perception, in politics, can become as consequential as reality. By the late 30s BCE, Octavian had begun to position himself as the guardian of Roman tradition against an encroaching Eastern monarchy centred on Cleopatra. He did so gradually, almost softly, under the cover of legal arguments and senatorial decrees. Accusations were framed as principled concerns. Personal rivalry with Antony was wrapped in claims to be defending the Republic from a queen over the sea. The war that would come was still, officially, not a war against a fellow Roman, but against a foreign power. That distinction mattered to Octavian, and he would guard it carefully. Through speeches, alliances in the Senate, and a steady drip of stories about Alexandria's queen, he was already moving legions into place, not only on the map, but in the minds of his fellow citizens. The clash between these two structures of power, Alexandria's intricate alliance and Rome's jealous, anxious republic, had not yet found its battlefield. But in the quiet churn of rumours and decrees, in the slow shaping of public feeling, the first movements of the coming conflict had already begun. The battlefield chosen for this clash of stories was not a marble forum or a palace hall, but a stretch of water off the western coast of Greece, near a low headland called Actium. If you picture it now, do not begin with the thunder of battle. Begin instead with waiting. For days, even weeks, fleets lay facing each other over the gentle swell of the Ionian Sea. Antony and Cleopatra had brought a vast armada. Heavy, many-banked ships, some reinforced for ramming, others built as floating platforms for archers and artillery. Octavian's admiral Agrippa commanded a somewhat smaller but more manoeuvrable force, with crews that had been hardened by long practice and recent campaigns. Between them, the sea was not yet a place of noise, but of patterns, lines of hulls rocking slowly, masts tracing quiet arcs against the sky, sails furled or half loosened as the wind shifted. Lanterns burned at night, reflected in black water. During the day, oars shipped and unshipped with disciplined regularity, as patrols tested the edges of the other side's control. The stakes on that water were immense. For Antony and Cleopatra, the fleet was not only a military asset, but a kind of floating court and treasury. Many of Antony's best soldiers and loyal officers had followed him to Greece. Cleopatra had joined him with Egyptian ships, money, grain, and crews, resources carefully gathered over years of preparation. Losing here might mean not just defeat in one campaign, but the collapse of their entire Eastern coalition. Octavian's position, while stronger than he allowed his speeches to suggest, was not without strain. Maintaining armies and fleets so far from Italy, feeding them, keeping them supplied with timber, rope, and pay, all under the eyes of Roman citizens weary of civil war, this required an intricate web of logistics and political reassurance. His power, too, was concentrated in those ships and legions. A catastrophe at sea would have shaken the fragile consensus he had built in Rome. As the standoff lengthened, the sea itself became an ally and an enemy for both sides. Food had to be ferried from the countryside. Disease moved easily through crowded camps and ships. Crews grew restless. Horses weakened on limited forage. Agrippa, controlling key coastal points, cut Antony's lines of supply bit by bit. Ancient writers speak of shortages, of illness, of a growing sense that time was working for Octavian, not for the fleet anchored off Actium. Inside Antony's command circle, debates seem to have unfolded over how to break the deadlock. Some advised abandoning the sea altogether and trying to fight on land, where Antony's experience was greatest. Others argued that retreat back to Egypt, preserving the fleet for a later campaign was wiser than risking everything in a single engagement. Our sources, written later and shaped by Roman perspectives, do not agree on who urged which course, or on Cleopatra's exact role in these councils. She was certainly present, with her own ships and her own stake in the outcome, and it is reasonable to imagine her arguing from a long-term view of Egyptian survival. What we can say is that, in the end, Antony chose to fight a naval battle. On the morning that choice was tested, the sky, so far as our fragmentary accounts suggest, was clear. The fleets rode out into formation. Standards were raised. Orders passed in calls and signals. But what endured in the record is not the clash of bronze or the cries of men. It is the uncertainty that soon spread across the water. Antony's heavier ships advanced in a line, designed to absorb the initial impact and use their bulk in close fighting. Agrippa's lighter vessels tried to outflank and harass them, exploiting gaps, setting fires where they could. In this manoeuvring, with oars churning the sea and smoke beginning to drift, Cleopatra's squadron, stationed to the rear with Egyptian ships, became the pivot of 1,000 later interpretations. At some point in the battle, her fleet raised sail and broke from the line, turning south, away from the fighting, on a course that would lead back toward Egypt. Ancient authors, hostile to her and eager to absolve Romans of responsibility, described this as flight, desertion, even treachery. Yet when we look closely, the sequence is not so simple. One possibility is that Cleopatra and Antony had agreed beforehand on a contingency plan. If the battle turned against them, they would extract the core of their forces, their treasure, and their chances for the future, rather than lose everything in a single day. Another interpretation suggests that Cleopatra's departure was the signal for Antony to disengage as well, that the two moved together by design rather than by impulse. We know that, seeing her sails, Antony left his flagship, boarded a smaller, faster vessel and followed. Was this panic, as later moralizing historians claimed, or obedience to a prearranged maneuver? The sources do not allow certainty. What is clear is that once Cleopatra's and Antony's ships had turned, much of the remaining fleet was left behind in confusion. Some continued to fight and were captured, others surrendered, still others were burned. Agrippa could claim the victory. Octavian could claim that Rome had triumphed over an eastern queen who fled the field. On the sea itself, as the day wore on, the sounds would have faded. Oars slowing, shouts dropping to the businesslike murmurs of mopping up. On the horizon, growing smaller, a group of ships carried Cleopatra and Antony away from Greece. They had not died on that calm stretch of water. They had not been captured. But the structure of their power, the elaborate architecture of alliances and territories they had woven from Alexandria, had taken a blow from which it would not recover. Ahead of them lay a long, weary journey back to Egypt, south along coasts and open water, past islands and harbours where their names no longer carried the same weight. Behind them, Octavian's victory at Actium would soon be turned into something more than a military success. In the months to come, it would harden into a story of a decadent queen defeated, of a republic saved, narratives already forming as their ships, under a quiet sky, slipped farther and farther from the shores of Greece and angled toward the familiar lights of Alexandria. By the time Cleopatra and Antony returned to Alexandria, the city they had once filled with embassies and celebrations had changed its breathing. The wide streets still stretched between colonnades, the Pharaoh still sent its revolving light across the water, and the palaces still stood along the shore. But behind carved doors, bolts were drawn more often than before. Merchants who had once competed for the favour of the court now waited to see which way the wind from Rome would blow. At the great harbour, ships still came and went, yet the mood along the quays was subdued. More hushed conversations, more anxious glances toward the horizon where, someday soon, Octavian's sails might appear. Ceremonies continued because kingdoms do not stop on a single day. There were still processions, still offerings in temples, still audiences granted to envoys. Cleopatra, trained from childhood in the performance of rule, maintained the forms of monarchy. Decrees were issued, taxes assessed, petitions heard. But around these rituals something quieter gathered, a sense that each act might be among the last of its kind. News travelled ahead of Octavian's legions. Dispatches arrived from the eastern provinces Antony had once commanded, reporting defections, surrenders, new oaths taken in Octavian's name. Cities that had sent ships and soldiers to support Antony now opened their gates to his rival. Allies calculated their chances and sought to preserve themselves. A structure built on mutual advantage and shared enemies was dissolving under the pressure of a single, relentless narrative. Rome had chosen its future, and it did not include Antony. In Alexandria, attempts at negotiation emerged, as they almost always do in the narrowing space between power and defeat. Ancient writers preserve fragments of these final diplomatic moves. We hear that Antony sent envoys to Octavian, offering to retire, to live in obscurity, even, in some versions, to take his own life if Cleopatra and her children could be spared. Other accounts suggest Cleopatra opened her own channels, independent of Antony, proposing to abdicate, to place Egypt and its wealth under Roman protection, if she and her heirs were allowed some measure of safety. The details differ, and Roman authors sometimes fold their own moral lessons into the story, but through the contradictions we glimpse the same essential shape: a queen and a general testing every possible avenue that might leave something standing when the legions arrived. Octavian, advancing methodically, had little incentive to accept half measures. He answered politely at a distance, keeping negotiations alive enough to prevent desperate resistance, but not enough to concede real power. His letters, as reported, distinguish sharply between Cleopatra and Antony, offering the possibility of mercy to the queen if she abandoned her Roman partner, making it clear that Antony himself was already condemned in the eyes of Rome. Inside the palace, the pressure of these messages must have been immense. We can imagine councils that stretched late into the night, maps unrolled, reports read aloud, arguments made for flight to distant allies, for one last battle, for surrender on carefully crafted terms. Cleopatra, experienced in crisis after years of civil war and shifting Roman politics, would have understood the danger of trusting promises from a man who intended to reshape the world. Antony, worn by campaigns, illness, and the erosion of his base, faced the collapse not only of a political career, but of the identity he had built as Rome's victorious commander in the east. When Octavian finally approached Egypt in earnest, bringing both land forces and ships, the options grew narrower still. Some of Antony's remaining troops defected. Others, loyal but exhausted, could offer only a brief symbolic resistance. Skirmishes flared and faded. The outcome more than ever seemed foregone. Antony's end, recorded by hostile sources but carrying an undertone of human fatigue, belongs to this moment of unravelling. Defeat reached him not as a single blow, but as a series of confirmations: a cavalry force routed, a bridge seized, a contingent that did not hold. One account describes him watching from Alexandria as a last attempt to contest Octavian's approach failed, realizing that the army he depended on no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The political edifice, clients, legions, governors, had already slipped away. Now the physical defences were following. In this atmosphere, ancient authors tell of a message reaching Antony that Cleopatra was dead. Whether this report was a tragic misunderstanding, a manipulation designed to provoke a decision, or an error magnified by later storytellers, we cannot say with certainty. What we can see is the shape of Antony's response, a sense that, with his public role ruined and the partner of his final decade gone, or believed gone, there was no honourable path remaining within the codes he had lived by. He chose to fall on his own sword, the traditional Roman gesture that allowed a defeated commander to claim, in some small way, agency over the manner of his leaving. The details, like so much in this story, are filtered through sources eager to frame him as both tragic and self-condemned. But behind their rhetoric lies the quieter image of a man at the end of a long exhaustion, making a final bleak calculation within a collapsing world. Cleopatra did not die with him. The most familiar version of the story brings Antony mortally wounded to the queen, who had taken refuge in a fortified part of the palace complex, perhaps the mausoleum she had begun to prepare for herself. In this telling, he is hoisted up to her. They share a last meeting, and then he dies in her presence. Whether this scene unfolded exactly as later authors described, or whether it took on more theatrical contours in retelling, its emotional outline reflects something true. Their political partnership, forged over years of shared campaigns and plans, ended in the shadow of imminent conquest. After Antony's death, Cleopatra stood alone at the centre of a chessboard with very few remaining pieces. Octavian entered Alexandria as a victor, but a careful one. The city, its grain, its treasures, and its symbolic weight were too important to be squandered in chaos. He met the Queen, according to our sources, not as an equal, but not as an anonymous captive either. She was questioned, assessed, observed. There are hints that she still argued about her children, about the future of Egypt, perhaps even about the terms under which she might live out her days. It is here that her final choice comes into focus, though the exact line of its edges remains blurred. Roman authors, writing under the new regime, largely agree that Cleopatra resolved not to be displayed in Octavian's triumph in Rome. For a Hellenistic monarch, educated in the traditions of Alexander and the Ptolemies, the prospect of walking in chains through foreign streets, an object of spectacle before a foreign populace, represented not only personal humiliation, but the symbolic annihilation of the kingdom she embodied. How she enacted that refusal is less clear. The most famous account speaks of an asp, an Egyptian cobra, brought to her in a basket of figs or hidden among her clothing, allowed to bite her, bringing a quiet, decisive poisoning. Other versions suggest she used a fast-acting ointment or a mixture of toxins prepared by her physicians. Some later writers, skeptical of the snake story, point to the practical difficulties and propose a simpler method of poison taken by mouth or applied through a wound. Ancient medicine in Egypt was sophisticated. Cleopatra, whose court included learned scholars, would have had access to many such substances. What they agree on is that she died in her own quarters, attended by a small group of loyal women, after making arrangements as far as she could, for her burial with Antony, for the protection of at least some of her children, for the dignity of her own memory. When Octavian's men discovered her, it was too late to reverse her decision. In that room, one person's life ended. Beyond its walls, something larger closed as well. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic Dynasty that had ruled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great came to an end. Her son by Caesar, Caesarion, was soon killed on Octavian's orders, removing the last direct rival who could claim both Roman and Egyptian legitimacy. Egypt itself was transformed from an independent kingdom, even one deeply entangled with Rome, into a Roman province held under the personal control of Octavian. Its grain would feed Rome. Its temples and monuments would become, in time, trophies and curiosities in an empire that now stretched unbroken across the Mediterranean. Octavian returned to Rome not only with treasure and captives, but with a story to tell. He had defeated not merely Antony, but the last great Hellenistic monarch, the Queen, who had once dealt with Caesar on almost equal terms, in the years that followed, as he reshaped the Roman state and took the name Augustus. The image of Cleopatra would be woven into his narrative. A foreign queen overcome, a dangerous allure neutralized, a threat to Roman order extinguished. For those in Alexandria who had known her voice, her policies, her presence in the courts and temples, the change must have felt more intimate. The festivals continued, but under new auspices. Romans took command of garrisons and treasuries. The city of lamps and libraries, still brilliant, now shone in the service of a different power. Yet even as the political world shifted decisively toward an imperial age, the traces of the woman at its hinge did not disappear. They lingered in papyrus accounts of taxes and decrees, in inscriptions naming her as Pharaoh, in scattered memories carried by her surviving children and by those who had served her. From these fragments, and from the stories written by her rivals, the figure of Cleopatra would be pieced together again and again, sometimes distorted, sometimes half-recognized, always returning. In the quiet after conquest, when Alexandria's harbour settled into its new role as a Roman gateway to the east, the last days of her reign receded into memory. But the questions they raised, about power and survival, about how a kingdom ends and what passes through that ending into the future, remained, waiting for other generations to ask them once more. When Egypt became a Roman province, the map of the Mediterranean did more than change its colours. A certain balance of worlds, Greek, Egyptian, Near Eastern, tilted toward a single centre. The kingdoms that had once negotiated, schemed and partnered with Rome were now, one by one, absorbed into it. With Alexandria's fall, the last of the great Hellenistic courts, with its bilingual decrees and layered rituals, gave way to a new order in which decisions radiated outward from Rome like spokes from a hub. For the Romans, this shift had to be explained, justified, even celebrated. In their histories, poems and public monuments, Cleopatra became part of that explanation. She appeared as the foreign queen who had bewitched Antony, the embodiment of Eastern luxury and excess, the foil against which Octavian's discipline and piety could shine. It was a portrait with a purpose, repeated until it hardened into something like truth for those who came after. Yet behind this carefully crafted image, other traces remained. In papyrus documents still bearing her cartouche, we glimpse a ruler concerned with grain shipments, tax remissions, temple endowments. In accounts of ambassadors and envoys, we see a queen who could converse in many languages without interpreters, shifting with ease between Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests and Roman statesmen. Her choices, alliances, coinage, patronage of scholars and cults, show a mind working within constraints, trying to reconcile dynastic survival with the demands of Rome and the expectations of an ancient land that recognized her as pharaoh. Because the record is incomplete, spaces open between the surviving lines. In those spaces, legend grows. Later ages filled them with their own desires and fears. Medieval chroniclers, Renaissance painters, playwrights and filmmakers all reshaped Cleopatra, sometimes as seductress, sometimes as tragic heroine, sometimes as a warning. Each generation arranged the fragments to tell a story it found meaningful, even when the real woman slipped further from view. What endures beneath these layers is the outline of a life lived at the edge of a transforming world. A monarch educated from childhood to read omens and ledgers, to weigh alliances, to address her people and her gods in their own tongues. A strategist responding again and again to crises not of her own making. Her kingdom was taken, her dynasty extinguished, her city folded into an empire that outlived her by centuries. But her image, painted, argued over, reinvented, moved forward through time. It travelled in Roman triumphs and hostile verses, in half-erased inscriptions and the silent drift of broken statues under the sea. It resurfaced wherever people wondered how power ends and what it costs to stand against the largest force of an age. If you listen closely, the story of Cleopatra does not resolve into a single clear moral. It flickers, the way lamplight on water shifts and reforms, never quite still. Her world has vanished, but its reflection lingers, in words, in ruins, in the enduring curiosity that keeps us returning to her name. If you'd like to hear more histories told in this way, you can gently like this video, subscribe for future journeys, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Then, when you're ready, you can let the lamps of Alexandria dim and drift a little further into sleep.